Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I can see some faces that have been attending the last few days. It's really great to see you again. And for everyone else, thanks for showing up, and thanks for coming to participate and listen to our keynote, the beginning of our third day and our final day of the narratives of selfhood and ambivalence. Sorry, it's been a long Saturday. Yeah, so thanks so much for coming. We've had a really great conference so far. Yesterday had a very strong post-colonial and decolonial focus. And the first day we were looking at queer identity and gender and sexuality and coming of age narratives. Today we've got a really wonderful two panels, but we'll start with Natalie Edwards, our keynote. And her, so we're really thankful to Natalie that she's able to come today. And I might just get straight into it if everyone's happy with that. So Natalie Edwards is Professor of French and Francophone Literature at the University of Adelaide. She's also currently acting Head of School of Humanities and Joint Deputy Dean of Research for the Faculty of Arts at the University of Adelaide. She's also president of the Australian Society of French Studies. She specialises in transnational and migrant literature, multilingual writing, and women's writing. She's also published on pedagogical innovations in languages in both undergraduate curricula and postgraduate research. And she currently holds an Australian Research Council funded discovery project with Christopher Hogarth in transnational French Australian literature. So Natalie has kindly agreed to be our keynote for the third day, and her paper is titled Gender and Generation, Elena Ferrante, Annie Ernaux, and the Legacy of Simone de Beauvoir. So thank you so much, Natalie. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Beth. And thanks for that very nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this. I think this is a wonderful initiative. And I'm really pleased at how the IMLR is hosting so many of these events that bring us together across borders despite the current situation. Beth and Françoise, thanks very much for this. I think it's amazing how much you two ladies do. First, I want to recognise that I'm sitting here in Adelaide on Kaurna land. The Kaurna peoples are the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to the Kaurna people, especially to the Kaurna elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. So as Beth said, my title is Gender and Generation, Elena Ferrante, Annie Ernaux, and the Legacy of Simone de Beauvoir. So the link with the idea of ambivalent selfhood is twofold, really. Firstly, these are two writers who play very deliberately, very consciously with this idea of selfhood and this ambivalent notion of what a subjectivity really is. These are constantly both these writers are constantly playing with genre, with revealing and concealing aspects of themselves within their life writing in the larger sense of the term, if you like. And secondly, I'm going to be talking to you today about a very ambivalent selfhood genre, if you like, which is fictionalized diaries. So not diaries by a first-person author, but by somebody who is writing a diary of a fictional character, of somebody else, which is very ambivalent, as you'll see. So, I am burning with shame, writes the narrator of Simone de Beauvoir's novella, The Woman Destroyed, after her husband leaves her. Published in 1967, this text tells the tale of Monique, who is abandoned by her husband after 22 years of marriage. In a didactic style, Beauvoir represents Monique as a caricature of a woman dependent on a man. Monique finds the news of her husband's departure shattering, and since the text is comprised of her diary, the reader reads her first-person account of how she had constructed her identity on the basis of her marriage. She had always aimed to be an ideal wife and mother, had few contacts outside the home beyond a small number of friends, and had no professional training or activity. Through the diary, we follow Monique through the months after the separation, in which she reacts obsessively, both she and other characters use this word to describe her behaviour, to what she perceives as an abandonment. She writes in her diary of how she is incapable of renewing her identity, and indeed she ends the tale alone, obsessed, abandoned, and ashamed. Several years later, Beauvoir wrote in her memoir, Tout compte fait, that she was dismayed to receive letters from women in similar situations, telling her that they appreciated her sympathetic rendering of their plights. As discussed by several critics of Beauvoir's work, including Toro Moy, Elizabeth Falaise, and Suzanne Dow, these misreadings of Monique's character and situation were a source of disappointment to Beauvoir, who wrote of how she hoped in The Woman Destroyed to represent the traps inherent in women depending on a man for their livelihood, femininity, and identity. Today, I discuss two texts that take up Beauvoir's mantle, one in French and one in Italian. Several decades after the publication of The Woman Destroyed, Elena Ferrante and Annie Ernaux published texts that explore the motif of a woman being abandoned by a man. Ferrante's The Days of Abandonment from 2002 and Ernaux's Simple Passion, 1991. Both writers have become iconic literary figures in their respective cultures. Italian author Ferrante has achieved fame for her subtle and innovative representations of female subjectivity. Beginning with her first novel in 1992, through her Neapolitan Quartet and her series of novels and short stories, her intimate, confessional portraits of female characters lay bare their vulnerability. Celebrated French author Annie Ernaux began publishing in 1974 with a searing account of an illegal abortion. Since this initial third-person narrative, most of her works have explored approaches to first-person narration, with a series of partially autobiographical texts that depict women from marginalized working-class backgrounds. Both writers may be said to write in the literary tradition of Beauvoir then. In this talk, I argue that these texts resonate in important ways with her iconic, yet oft misinterpreted, The Woman Destroyed. By focusing on the way in which these two texts subvert the generic expectations of the diary format, I argue that they depict women who are capable of moving beyond the traps to which Monique was confined. Representing social mores several decades later and playing with first-person narrative within diary fiction, these texts renew the narrative of the abandoned woman and would perhaps have countered Beauvoir's disappointments at the reception of her own text. So first, a bit of a theoretical contextual section of self and story, fictionalized diaries. As scholar of life writing Anna Jackson points out, the development of autobiography and life writing in the 1980s led to an increased interest in the genre of the diary. Scholars such as Jackson, Elizabeth Podnieks, Kylie Cardell, and Desiree Henderson have since probed the diary as life writing, suggesting that it has moved from a sidelined genre, to quote Henderson, a minimized, feminized, and even shameful form of writing, to a vibrant and established field of inquiry. Along these studies of the diary, scholarly attention to diary fiction has evolved. As opposed to a diary written by a named author, these texts are fictionalized diaries that create a narrator or protagonist and present their first-person narration as fictional accounts of daily experience. Lucy Hosker underscores the contested nature of the term, suggesting that confrontation with the oxymoronic fictional diary forces us as readers and critics to traverse the boundary between truth and fiction and to navigate a realm in which these two entities coexist more or less comfortably and convincingly. She pinpoints the 1970s and 1980s as the major period of theorization of this genre, pointing to 4 extended studies that set the parameters of the genre. The most comprehensive of these is Lorna Martin's study of the history of what she refers to as the diary novel. Martins defines this genre as a fictional prose narrative written from day to day by a single first-person narrator who does not address himself to a fictive addressee or recipient. By contrast, H. Porter Abbott prefers the term diary fiction, arguing that this form of writing constitutes a device rather than a genre. He suggests that diary fiction has 3 main functions: mimetic, thematic, and temporal. He theorizes the mimetic function as the way in which diary fiction plays with truth and realism. By thematic function, He refers to the ways in which the diary represents identity and self. He theorizes the temporal function as the way in which the diary represents time, developing a sense of immediacy and timelessness. Importantly, he pinpoints a specific characteristic of diary fiction, which is its capacity to expose this ordinarily unnoticed reflexive action by giving writing itself a role in the plot. In this talk, I read Ferrante's and Ernaux's works through Abbott's theory of the fictionalized diary. So first, I'm going to talk about the thematic function of the fictionalized diary. So in Abbott's theorization of diary fiction, the thematic function of this genre is its representation of identity and selfhood. I might just take that back there, and then I'll give you the quote in a moment. At the heart of fictionalized diaries is a central narrator protagonist who explores the parameters of their identity through the format of the diary. In The Days of Abandonment, the protagonist Olga's narrative explores her selfhood as she lives almost in isolation. Following her husband's announcement that he is leaving her, and her subsequent discovery that 40-year-old Mario is living with a woman 20 years younger than him, Olga is isolated at home. She has little contact with others during this time, except for a neighbor, a friend, and her 2 small children. In this isolated state, she is even physically confined since she becomes locked inside her apartment. She ponders her identity and the reasons why her husband left her. Olga's questioning of her identity leads her through 3 specific phases. The first delineates her reaction to Mario's departure and the immediate impact of the decision on her daily life. A crucial aspect of this questioning is her references to Simone de Beauvoir's The Woman Destroyed. Just a few pages into the text, Ferrante's narrator writes of having read the text as a teenager. So as you'll see, this is a very deliberate, conscious rewriting of Beauvoir's text. And I've put quite a long quote up here. It's quite nice giving a bit of a longer talk, because then you can put longer quotations in that give a bit of more of an idea that the texture of the text itself. So the quotation reads like this: "Don't be like the woman destroyed in a famous book of your adolescence. I saw the cover again in every detail. My French teacher had assigned it when I had told her too impetuously, with ingenuous passion, that I wanted to be a writer. It was 1978, more than 20 years earlier. Read this," she had said to me, and diligently I had read it. But when I gave her back the volume, I made an arrogant statement. "These women are stupid. Cultured women in comfortable circumstances, they broke like knickknacks in the hands of their straying men. They seemed to me sentimental fools. I wanted to be different. I wanted to write stories about women with resources, women of invincible words, not a manual for the abandoned wife with her lost love at the top of her thoughts." I said it breathlessly, all in one gulp, which was something I never did, and my teacher smiled ironically, a little bitterly. She too must have lost someone, something. And now, more than 20 years later, the same thing was happening to me. Olga makes explicit reference to the acts of reading Beauvoir's text then, and moreover to having misinterpreted due to the experience of youth. Ferrante, a woman writer of a different generation, writes a protagonist in a strikingly similar situation who misinterpreted Beauvoir's story as a younger woman, but who comes to appreciate the gravity of her situation as she herself questions her identity through her diary. Differently from Beauvoir's Monique, however, Olga moves beyond this initial obsession and shame. In the second phase of the text, the narrator recounts a crisis that takes place during one day. Locked in her apartment, her son falls ill, her dog dies, a colony of ants invades her home, and both her landline and mobile phone stop working. The questioning of her selfhood becomes acute as she fears she is losing control of herself and her mind, writing, for example, "Get moving again, right away, think of solutions, avoid surrendering to the senselessness of the day, hold the fragments of life together as if they still had their allotted place in a design." Victor Zarzar interprets this section as the unraveling that needs to happen in order for Olga's life to be restructured after abandonment. Following this day-long crisis, the third section of the text depicts Olga's return to self-control and the advent of an altered reality in which she finds harmony. In the final pages, after seeing Mario several months after the separation, she writes, "Oh, whoops. It was really true. There was no longer anything about him that could interest me. He wasn't even a fragment of the past, he was only a stain. Her self-questioning thus enables Olga to achieve resolution and to develop an identity separate from that of her husband, as Monique was unable to do. As Stefania Lucamantea argues in her comparison of the two texts, instead of despising Olga for her condition of societal imperfection, Ferrante empathizes with her, avoiding victimization and condemnation, and pragmatically looking for a position in society for her. By contrast, Ernaux's Simple Passion contains no specific reference to Beauvoir's work. Nevertheless, the premise of the text is strikingly similar to The Woman Destroyed, but with several specific innovations that push the tale into a different era of female identity and sexual mores. The unnamed narrator does not mention her age, but is an established writer with adult children. This is not a representation of a wife under 40 as in Ferrante's text, but a more experienced and independent voice. Moreover, this woman is not married. She refers to an earlier divorce and lives alone as a single woman who is professionally successful and financially independent. As readers familiar with Ernaux's work will know, these factors mirror the situation of Ernaux herself. Yet her career-long experimentation with first-person narrative prevents any reading of this text as autobiographical. The narrator's sense of abandonment emanates from her feelings for a married man with whom she has a romantic liaison. The man, referred to only as A, is a diplomat from Eastern Europe who is in Paris temporarily. The love affair is therefore destined to end abruptly, as the narrator recognizes from its beginning. Nevertheless, the narrator feels abandoned by this man and writes of obsessive behaviors she develops during his long and unpredictable absences. Indeed, the narrator avows that this professionally successful woman has lost sight of all else in her life. She writes, "I knew that nothing in my life, having children, passing exams, traveling to faraway countries, had ever meant as much to me as lying in bed with that man in the middle of the afternoon." The questioning of selfhood and identity, which constitutes the thematic function of diary fiction, is a recurrent theme in the narrator's meanderings. Significantly, the narrator does not write about the man or about the affair. Instead, this text depicts the narrator's reaction to it, and especially to her reaction to what she perceives as his abandonment of her. She writes in the opening pages, "From September last year, I did nothing more than wait for a man, for him to call me and come round to my place." She uses the word obsession to describe her behavior, and she writes that when he finally leaves France, "At first, when I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I didn't care whether I lived or died." Indeed, the narrator's relationship with A may appear challenging from a feminist perspective. This woman writer, who has a long history of representing female subjectivity, writes a first-person narrator who is wholly dependent upon a man, obsessive, reliant, and compulsive, and seemingly with no trajectory or values beyond this relationship. Yet this representation of identity and selfhood is completely different to that of Beauvoir's Monique. While Monique's questioning of her selfhood revealed that she relied so heavily on her husband that she had no identity beyond her marriage, Ernaux's narrator reveals a delight in her sexuality and freedom. Sylvie Romanovsky suggests that this text marks a change of direction in Ernaux's writing, since it is the first to recount a narrator's passionate relationship with a man. And Lorraine Day argues that it bears witness to Ernaux's desire to see women throw off the constraints which hinder the free expression of female sexuality. Although the narrator is obsessed and at times feels uncomfortable at her behavior, she also claims to feel no shame whatsoever. The narrator's candid expression of this lack of shame demonstrates that this is not a portrayal of a woman who is overcome by pain at a failed relationship. Instead, this exploration of selfhood reveals a woman delighting in the luxury of a passion while she has the opportunity to do so. And, contrary to Monique, who felt incapable of ever finding a renewed sense of identity, knows that this luxury is a temporary pleasure from which she plans to fully benefit. Nearly 50 years after the publication of Beauvoir's novella, Ernaux's text thus positions an abandoned woman in a very different societal context and reinvents the possibilities available to her. In this sense, Simple Passion can be read as a subtly crafted update of the story of abandonment, representing a renewed approach to female identity, sexuality, and desire in the late 20th century. So now I'm going to move to the mimetic function of the fictionalized diary. The mimetic function of diary fiction, as Abbott referred to it, is one of the reasons for its popularity among both readers and writers. Diary fiction provides an illusion of reality, inviting the reader to suspend judgment and believe the truthfulness of the character's diary. The familiar mode of the diary, based upon intimacy and confession, can thus be manipulated to produce highly relatable characters and situations, something Beauvoir exploited in her novella. Both Ferrante and Ernaux used the diary format to create an illusion of reality within their texts, yet for different purposes. The chapters of The Days of Abandonment are not dated according to a conventional diary, but contain references to time that move the narrative forward chronologically. The opening line of the work locates it in one April afternoon, while the next chapter begins 1 week later, in the following days, the next day, on Sunday evening, 2 days later, one morning in September, and culminating in 3 days later. The intimacy of the diary format is very tangible, therefore. Moreover, as in a conventional diary format, the entries are written from the perspective of an unknowing narrator who moves through her story day by day with no knowledge of how it will develop. There is no hint, for example, that she knows that she will eventually find harmony or fall in love again by the end of the time of writing. In the early chapters, this reveals the enormity of Olga's shock in clear lyrical prose. As she begins to spiral out of control, however, the tone and style of her narration changes. Lucamante refers to what she calls Olga's useless, silent dialogue, points to the interplay between standard Italian and dialect in Olga's language. Similarly, Zarzar notes a transition from the highly curated Italian that opens Olga's account into the ungrammatical and obscene language that she adopts later, viewing this linguistic change as revealing a crisis not only of identity, but of language itself. Alongside these changes noted by Lucamante and Zarzar, a further significant change in this section of the text is its pace. Whereas the first section of the text presents the narrator's daily occurrences in a recognizable diary form, the narration of the second section of the text is marked by immediacy. The narrator narrates events that have just taken place, rather than presenting them as a reflection on the events of a day. A striking example of this is the one-sex scene in the text. After calling in to see her neighbor Carano, a man she hardly knows and describes as a stranger, late one night, Olga tearfully tells him of Mario's abandonment of her for a younger woman, and a sexual encounter follows. In 7 long pages, it's cringe-worthy. I mean, we're so close to this woman going through this very awkward experience. You're sitting there really uncomfortable reading these very, very long 7 pages. Ferrante recounts the encounter between an abandoned woman who is desperate to feel attractive to a man and a man who seems only vaguely interested in her. The reader reads Olga's perspective in her first-person narration, in which she gives a running commentary of the awkwardness of their half-hearted movements and her feelings of disgust. She writes at the beginning, "All I could do was to sink by degrees into repugnance," and her comments throughout reveal her perspective. "I felt like crying. I clenched my teeth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to burst into tears again. And even I felt myself flare up with shame." All the while, the first-person narrative reveals that she is imagining sexual encounters between her husband and his 20-year-old partner. This departs from the narration of standard diary fiction, then. In this section of Ferrante's text, the narrator presents the events in an interior monologue with no reflection or ordering of thoughts. The writing has thus departed from the conventional format of diary fiction and instead mirrors the narrator's spiral of loss of self-control. Nevertheless, this temporary departure from conventional diary fiction increases its mimetic function, since the text portrays a narrator who is even more relatable and recognizable. Whereas Beauvoir's Monique was static and unchanging, Ferrante's Olga lays bare the vulnerability of her character to represent the ravages that can still be wreaked upon a woman. But, importantly, she is able to overcome these and recoup her narrative by the end of her text. Ernaux similarly represents the vulnerability of her female narrator. The mimetic function of diary fiction is located in this highly relatable story recounted by a highly relatable narrator. She is depicted engaged in everyday activities such as sitting in her living room watching the news. She learns of historical events that enable the reader to situate the story in a recognizable time frame. The war in Iraq, for example. But these events are far removed from her concerns, all of which revolve around her relationship with A. Michel Scaton-Tessier notes that no other of Ernaux's texts depicts the narrator's direct interplay with living space as much as Passion Simple, in which almost the entire narrative takes place inside the suburban home, and points to the angst the narrator experiences upon leaving it. When she does leave it, the narrator is portrayed as living a very recognizable daily existence, riding the metro, going to the supermarket, and visiting the hairdresser, for example. The narrator confides in a confessional manner, for example. At the hairdresser's one day, I saw a talkative woman to whom everyone had been speaking perfectly normally until she announced, her head tilted back over the basin, "I'm being treated for my nerves." Immediately, the staff stiffened and addressed her with distant reserve, as if this irrepressible confession were proof of her insanity. I feared I would also be considered abnormal if I had said, "I'm having a passionate love affair." Yet when I was among other women at the supermarket checkout or at the bank, I wondered whether they too were wrapped up in a man. In this passage, the narrator places herself in recognizable everyday places, points to normal behaviors, and calls attention to the ordinary women she views around her. The narrator is thus depicted as an ordinary woman whose daily activities mirror those of so many other women, rather than as a successful, educated, and independent writer. Nevertheless, the unnamed narrator's intimate confessional style of writing lays bare her emotionally complex response to the situation. She highlights the past experiencing and contrasts her feelings with A's nonchalance, commenting tellingly that, "Sometimes I told myself that he might spend a whole day without even thinking of me. Compared to my own obsession, such indifference filled me with wonder." She also communicates her discomfort with this unfamiliar situation, hesitating to tell even her friends about the affair. Yet Ernaux's narrator also emphasizes the pleasure she derives from the situation. She comments tellingly in a footnote, for example, "A panel of young people interviewed by the women's magazine Marie Claire strongly condemned the love affairs of their mothers, either divorced or living on their own. One girl remarked bitterly, 'All my mother's lovers could do was to help her escape into her dreams. Who could ask for more?'" The way in which she accentuates the pleasure of her situation highlights her position as an independent woman who chooses to exercise her sexuality how she wishes. Whereas Monique's abandonment in The Woman Destroyed was so painful because of her lack of identity beyond her marriage, this narrator's abandonment is painful because of the luxury the affair awards her. After all, she knows all along that it is merely a brief interlude in a much fuller life. And now finally, I'm going to talk about the third function, the temporal function of the fictionalized diary. So this brings us to the representation of time, which is of central importance in both texts. Abbott's theory of diary fiction highlighted the temporal function of this form of writing, suggesting that diaries emphasize the present, which creates an immediacy, but which also creates, in his words, an acute orientation toward the future. In Ferrante's text, time moves forward, but in a highly irregular way. In the first section of the text, following Mario's departure from the family home and his avowal of infidelity, Olga's narration moves at a steady pace. The first chapter recounts the first week following his departure, the second chapter covers the subsequent 2 weeks, and the successive chapters each deal with several days at a time. It is in the second section of the text, however, that Ferrante's text departs most significantly from the temporal function of diary fiction. As opposed to the irregular narration of the previous months, this second section spans one weekend in minute detail. Several changes in the narrative voice occur during this section, many of which are exemplified when the narrator comments, "Olga has a terror of the frenzy of doing, she fears the need for prompt reaction. Quick steps, quick gestures will migrate into her brain. She can't tolerate the inner roar that will assault her, the pounding temples, the nausea, the cold sweat, the craze to be faster and faster, faster and faster." An immediate note of departure is the use of the third person, as Olga is at this point objectifying herself. As Roberta Dalman demonstrates, the focalization of the text means that the point of view is exclusively Olga's, and that although she uses both free direct and free indirect speech, all we read is from her perspective and reflects her state of mind. While the use of the third-person narrator does not change the point of view, it moves the text further from the format of diary fiction. In addition to the third-person narration, this quotation also reveals a change in tense, as the past tense of much of the text is here replaced by the present. This generic subversion brings the reader closer to the mind of the protagonist, emphasizing Olga's deteriorating psychological state. It also reflects the temporary nature of her suffering, since the text returns in the last section to the format of diary fiction. In the final pages, the third-person narrator disappears, the text returns to the present tense, and the narration slows to its former pace. The return of the temporal function of the diary fiction occurs as Olga finds resolution and harmony. Whereas Monique's diary in Beauvoir's text had no closure, the way in which Ferrante departs from a diary format and then returns to it demonstrates the ability of the later protagonist to overcome a situation the earlier could not. Simple passion also subverts the temporal function Abbott discerned in this genre. Ernaux's work comprises short vignettes that do not contain specific dates, but which mention nonetheless markers of time. They move from this summer to from September last year, in the spring that summer, now it's April, and end February 1991. In this way, the narrative moves forward chronologically, recording the narrator's thoughts and experiences as the relationship takes place. The text records the present of the action, yet also gestures towards a future time, therefore. In the same way as Ferrante's text, this narrative style creates an immediacy, reducing the time between the events and the writing of them, and placing the narrator in a position of ignorance, just as in a conventional diary format, in which the narrator writes of what has just happened with no knowledge of future events. Ernaux's narration is thus suspended in time, capturing the intensity of the emotions the narrator experiences while obsessed with A and awaiting his next phone call. Yet, Ernaux also complicates this chronology. Indeed, subverting narratological time is one of her major preoccupations. Simon Kemp reads her overall writing project as one of writing, to quote him, one of writing time, as she moves between timeframes, between the narrating self and the narrated self, and repeatedly revisiting past events and recounting them with the perspective of added experience. In Simple Passion, the action is recounted in two main tenses. First is the imperfect tense, which is the time of ongoing, continuous action in the past, and which suggests a lack of finitude to the events and to the relationship. Second is the perfect tense, which is seldom used in literary writing. This tense strikes a note of familiarity, reinforcing the notion that this is an ordinary woman talking informally of her experiences, whereas the simple past is considered to be the more elegant and sophisticated literary tense. This past tense narration conforms to the temporal function of diary fiction and reinforces the perspective of the diary writer who is unaware of how events will unfold. This past time is then disrupted, however, by sections in the present tense. In these sections, the narrator frequently writes about the writing process, which halts the narrative and offers commentary upon it. This occurs when she writes, for example, "I went on doing the things that alleviate sorrow, offering hope when, theoretically, there is no longer cause for any, playing patience, slipping a 10-franc coin into a beggar's paper cup at Aubert metro station, making the wish that he'll call, he'll come back. Perhaps, after all, writing is one of these things." By calling attention to the present time of writing after the episodes recounted in the past have subsided, this narrator highlights her existence beyond the relationship and beyond the time frame it covers. By moving beyond the standard time of diary fiction, she conveys her awareness that this relationship is temporary, and that although she experiences pain at the abandonment she feels between A's visits, she appreciates its temporary luxury. Differently from Monique, then, who cannot move beyond the identity of the text and who cannot imagine a future time without her husband, this narrator is well aware that she will resume her life and her identity as an independent woman as soon as it is over. So moving on to the place of writing in this fictionalized diary then. Ernaux's narrator's commentary upon the writing process brings us to the final element of Abbott's theorization of diary fiction, that writing itself is a recurrent theme within it. Indeed, writing is a significant element of both texts, as both narrators identify themselves as writers. This is a striking departure from Beauvoir's novella, in which Monique had no professional activity. Ferrante's Olga refers to a series of jobs she has performed that revolve around writing. For example, she mentions having written a long story set in Naples and the following year had published it easily, and alludes to a novel she is currently writing. Yet she claims to suffer from writer's block and is unable to progress her novel throughout much of the text. As the narrative nears its end, however, writing becomes a key element of her recovery. She writes, "To calm myself, I got into the habit of writing until dawn. In the beginning, I tried to work on the book that I had been trying to put together for years, but then I gave it up, disgusted. Night after night, I wrote letters to Mario, even though I didn't know where to send them. I hoped that sooner or later I would have a way of giving them to him. I liked to think he would read them. I wrote in the silent house, with only the breathing of the children in the other room. When the pen had cut into my swollen fingers until they hurt, and my eyes became blinded by too many tears, I would go to the window. In those long hours, I was the sentinel of grief, keeping watch along with a crowd of dead words." The narrator thus writes in several genres: letters to Mario, a novel, notebooks she refers to elsewhere, and presents writing as a source of pain and frustration that eventually leads to solace and understanding. She marks a turning point when she was able one night to capture all the absurdity in writing, and begins the following day to look for work, which again involves writing, since she organizes correspondence for a local company in several languages. As opposed to the single-layered repetitive narration of Monique, Olga writes herself and expresses her thoughts in several different forms of writing, which enables her to achieve a renewed sense of identity. Ferrante's narrator thus writes herself free of the constraints of the abandoned woman of the earlier text. The unnamed narrator of Simple Passion calls attention to the fact that she is a professional writer at several points throughout the text. As discussed earlier, as the text progresses, incursions into the text that reflect upon the process of writing become more prevalent. The text thus becomes a dual narrative. In one narrative, the passage of time moves forward, and the reader is in the position of the witness to the intimate account of the narrator's feelings of abandonment. In the other, time is arrested by a commentary on the writing process. The narrator writes, for example, "During all this time, I felt I was living out my passion in the form of a novel, but now I'm not sure in which style I am writing about it. In the style of a testimony, possibly even the sort of confidence one finds in women's magazines, a manifesto or a statement, or maybe a critical commentary." Whereas Ferrante writes an interior monologue that allows the reader to view her narrator's inward spiral, the narrator of Ernaux's dual narrative allows us to read her vulnerability as well as her commentary on the process of writing it. What is particularly striking about this is that the narrator does not temper the narrative of obsession and shame, and does not order her thoughts as a diary writer might. This act of laying herself bare is made more acute, since she proclaims unapologetically that her experience is valid. Importantly, as opposed to the narrator of Ferrante's text, she claims that the process of writing did not lessen her grief. Whereas Ferrante's narrator needed to overcome an abandonment in order to renew her identity and move forward, Ernaux is fully aware of her independent selfhood. So to conclude then, taken together, these two texts provide an important response to Beauvoir's The Woman Destroyed. While Ernaux's cannot be considered a rewriting of the earlier text in the same way as Ferrante's is, both offer an updated version of the tale of abandonment. Ferrante shows that the pain of an abandonment endures regardless of time frame or cultural context. Olga feels equally as shocked, crushed, and betrayed as Beauvoir's Monique, yet without nullifying the intensity of such an experience and its effects upon a woman and her children, Ferrante depicts a way forward for her narrator. The text does not arrive at a complete and coherent resolution, and there is little indication of Olga's future identity, but the psychological turmoil subsides. She embarks upon a new relationship, and she portrays her life as calm and harmonious. Ernaux's text is more concerned with the pleasure of an affair the narrator knows to be temporary, and the way in which she willingly endures the pain of it. More importantly, however, is that Ernaux appears to use the tale as a means of experimenting with writing, attempting to capture the time of an obsession and comparing it to the time of writing. by taking Beauvoir's diary fiction and telling the tale several decades later with innovative approaches to the genre, these authors both offer a corollary to Monique's tale. They first insist that while such an experience is traumatic, there is scope for women to move beyond a narrative of abandonment. Furthermore, the subversion of the genre of diary fiction used by Beauvoir pushes the boundaries of this genre, stretching it far beyond the minimized, feminized stereotype pinpointed by Henderson, and using it instead as a vehicle for a renewed approach to contemporary female subjectivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was a really wonderful way to start the day. I think there's a lot of resonance that we'll continue to hear throughout the morning with the panels that will follow as well. So thank you so much for taking us through those two very rich texts. So I'll just, before I start taking questions, remind everybody very quickly that this is being recorded, so you're welcome to write your message in the chat and I can read it out if you wish to remain anonymous. However, it would also be lovely if you could raise your hand and ask your question to Natalie directly. So do we have any questions to start us off?
I think I can see Frankie, Françoise.
Yes, sorry. Yes, please go ahead, Frankie.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Natalie. I really enjoyed the presentation and so many interesting angles in terms of time and generation and aging as well as changing cultural context, which I really enjoyed. And I was just wondering if you had anything more to say about a kind of intergenerational tension in terms of feminist perspectives, because I think you had a kind of presentation of the younger women as saying we don't need a man, and then that being presented as naive, as a kind of something to be moved past, but then also younger women condemning their mother's affairs. And I wondered if there was a kind of shift in feminist thinking in an aged or generation perspective.
That's a great question. Thanks, Frankie. In fact, in the longer piece, the article that I've written about this, I start with a more of an analysis of A Woman and Destroyed itself, because Beauvoir's text is really interesting, going back to that. She's got a woman I guess she's about in her 50s. She's got two grown-up children. And both of these texts that are riffing off this idea, Ernaux is not a rewriting of it, but it's an interesting rendering of the same trope, if you like. But Ferrante's really is a rewriting of it. They're both changing her position and her situation. So Ferrante's got, she's under 40 with two small kids. Ernaux has got a narrator who's older with grown-up kids who she actually kind of abandons them. But she says at one point in the text that she tells them to get out of the house like a mother cat would tell her kittens to get out of the house, this kind of thing. And so it's really interesting to see these three texts that portray a woman from a different generation and a different familial status and different sort of maternal status in a different way. I think that there is an idea in these texts that the older woman is more experienced, can look back on the self, especially in Ferrante's text, can look back on the younger self and think, well, I was having a good time, I was inexperienced, I was naive, but here I am, a fully fledged independent woman. I can enjoy where I am now. Despite that horrible sex scene, I can enjoy my desire, my sexuality, my female identity, and I can move forward beyond this. So it's a nice sort of full circle almost, coming from Monique, that older woman who was abandoned and fell apart. Rompu was what Beauvoir said, broken rather than destroyed. And here these two women are doing something quite different.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so fascinating, the idea that the young women are allowed to be independent, but maybe not financially so or mature enough, and older women seem that they should have a partner, but yet able to enjoy that independence. So yeah, thank you so much.
No, you're very welcome. It's quite fun. I know a few people who in fact, one very dear colleague of mine said that she always loved Ernaux's text until she read this one, and this was the text that turned her away from Ernaux. And I thought that was so sad, because you could, I don't want to say misinterpret, but you could read it as an anti-feminist text, but it really isn't. You know, she's trying to show an older woman in her 50s enjoying the luxury of this passion, knowing that it's temporary, go back to another self and another life, and that's kind of a revendication of the female self and the aging female self.
Thank you very much. So any other questions to further this discussion?
I do want to speak. Why do I do that?
So we can hear you. So please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Maggie.
Yeah, right. Hello. Yes, I was fascinated by that. Partly, it's not my field, but partly because it is the density of what you were portraying, and the density of obviously the text that you were discussing. I wonder if when you worked on this, you've asked yourself, maybe this is not very politically correct of me, is this activity of talking about oneself in some way narcissistic? Or could it also be, and this is the word that you will probably not like, neurotic? What is it, or is it indeed therapeutic? I think these are three quite interesting ingredients of the density of what you were talking about.
Oh, thanks very much, Maggie. You're absolutely right. That's why I think my colleague who loved Ernaux until she read this work decided that she no longer did, and turned away from reading her. Yeah, because I mean, she is writing a neurotic older woman who is obsessed with this man. And it's funny, I teach this text a lot. I think I teach this every year, this text, and there's a polarization amongst the students. You know, some of them love it, some of them hate it, because it's difficult to read this. You know, it's difficult to resolve this. My view on it is that she's putting this out there. She's writing herself, Ernaux in particular, as this neurotic woman, in order to say it's okay for a woman in her 50s who is a mother, a professionally successful, independent woman, to have this interludes, to enjoy her passion, her desire, her sexuality, how she wants to, and then to go back to her life. She can have this alternative female identity, something that women have been derided for, but then she can get over it and come back and enjoy the different facets of her female subjectivity, if you like. It's part of her femininity. It's not all of her femininity. She's not constrained by this. It's something that she experiences in the short term as a passion, as a luxury, and then she carries on. And she's a single woman in her 50s, you know, and so I mean, this is, it's quite interesting.
But the compulsion of the writing activity is also incredibly dense, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. How do they render that in writing and publicize that? I think that there are some of those critics that I mentioned there, Lorraine Day and Sylvia Romanovsky, that they think it's a real celebration of female sexuality, and I think it is to an extent, but it is somewhat off-putting when you read this feminist writer who is writing herself, or writing a very confessional, intimate self in such a way. But I do think it's a vehicle of moving beyond that, saying that this is part of a larger accepted form of female sexuality, and that we're no longer confined to that in the way that Monique's narrator was all those years ago.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Oh, I think Valentina just popped something in the chat.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm assuming that it's for me to read.
It's a bit noisy here. That's why I didn't want to. You can hear in the background. It was wonderful though. So I was thinking about, the idea of translingual encounters, especially with dialect in Ferrante, whether they can tell us something in particular about the complexity of female identities, rather than, because it's been relating a lot about the working class issues, indifference, but it was really that quote that you shared made me think that there is a lot more there. So yeah, I would love to know what you think.
Thanks, Valentina. Yeah, of course. It's amazing that this second section of the text, when she unravels, it's quite amazing, because the first and the third sections, in the first she's very shocked, in the third she's finding harmony, but this second long section, she's spiraling out of control, and she's losing her control over her psychological state, and she's writing this in these huge streams of consciousness, interior monologues, and this lyrical prose that opens the text is replaced by this very strange staccato kind of prose, and it includes some dialect, and I think that's part of Ferrante's rendering of this woman in distress, that she is trying to express something in a different way, in a way that she feels perhaps more comfortable with her own dialect rather than with a standard language. And
that's amazing.
Sorry,
that's amazing. Like almost reverting back to the origins in a sense, or to a kind of a comfort area. Like it's really it's fascinating.
It really is, because this is the point when she's unable to write as well. So she's trying to write a novel. She gets writer's block. She can't write that, but she can write her diary in some dialect, So that's the place where she can articulate her identity to some extent, where she can't in the actual novel that she's writing.
Thank you. That's fantastic stuff. Lots to think.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we've just got Beth, who's put her hand up, so we'll jump to her first. And I think, Owen, do you have a question as well? I think so.
Hello, it's me this time.
Yes.
Hello, one book I couldn't help but think of each time you were mentioning this kind of narrative was Duras' L'Amant, which I feel in a way is even more radical and subversive of both narrative and the abandoned lover than the text that you've been referring to, in that Duras says even more radically, perhaps, at the same time as writing her story, l'histoire de ma vie n'existe pas, and the existence of the former lover seems to be even less important to her in the past and even the present than the lovers you talk about in your own novels.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Owen. You just reminded me, I've actually been teaching my course on women's writing this semester, and I've just done Passion Simple and L'Amant, and I've got a bunch of essays that came in just last night, actually, midnight on Friday, that are going to be comparing these. So there's going to be nuance of those. But yeah, that's a great text. Duras, she's timeless, isn't she? But isn't that interesting that she writes her sexuality in such a different way, and across those three renderings of that story as well, from Barrage to L'Amant de la Chine du Nord, as well as that rewriting of a female sexuality, and the place of the lover is very much an addendum. I mean, she's talking about herself and about her writing, and he's just consigned to the past, isn't he?
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating text. Thanks, Owen.
Okay.
Okay, and Beth, would you like to ask your question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Françoise, and thanks for a really wonderful paper, Natalie. Just in relation to Valentina's question, made me think about the fact that questions of class are pretty important in a very general sense to both authors. I sadly haven't read The Days of Abandonment, but I really love Elena Ferrante for the reason that most people love her, the Neapolitan novels. But yeah, I, as far as I can understand, I genuinely think she's concerned with class, at least to a small degree. And I'm wondering whether, in comparison with de Beauvoir, how do you kind of interpret this dependence on a man or degree of independence with women? How does that compare in a temporal sense? And the degree to which women are kind of more independent, generally speaking, since the publication of these two texts that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's really interesting that Beauvoir's text there was very much about a middle-class woman, and not in the educated sort of intellectual sense, but she was very. They were. This is a couple that was quite well off. The husband earns a decent living. They go away for weekends. They travel. They do all of these things, cultural activities, and then he finds a younger woman, and her life falls apart. Whereas in these two texts, these are educated women, but these are not high class, financially independent women. I mean, they are professional, they're working for a living. And it's interesting to see that the education they can fall back on, especially the language, the writing, the books, they both talk about the books they read as well. So it's less about that sort of class privilege, and more about finding themselves through words, through literature, through exploring their identity through the words of others. And that's quite fascinating in terms of that class movement going from the late 1960s to 1991 and 2002 in this case. Yeah. Thanks, Beth.
Okay, thank you everybody for your questions. So I think we might have to close the question time now. And Beth, am I right in thinking that we'll leave a 5-minute break before our panel? Yes, so we'll start our first panel at 9:05. But yes, I'd just like to say a final thank you to Natalie for that wonderful keynote, and also to everybody for their questions. It was a really lovely discussion that we got to have at the end there. So we'll be back at 9:05 and see you soon.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you Françoise and Beth again for such brilliant organisation. Thank you, Natalie, for a lovely, a brilliant start to the day with a brilliant paper. So I'm going to introduce this panel, which is entitled "Trouble Every Way: Ambivalent Selves in Contemporary French Women's Writing." Unfortunately, Rebecca Rosenberg can't make it this morning because she's unwell. So we're going to go ahead just with Dominique and with Adina. So we'll have a bit more time for discussion this morning, which will be nice. So a bit of kind of flexibility time, which is nice. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and then we'll have at the end, as usual, time for discussion, and you can kind of post in the chat if you'd rather not appear on camera, or you can raise your digital hand or your actual hand, and we'll come to you and you can speak live. So all the standard stuff. So I'm delighted. So Dominique is going to speak first. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dominique Carlini Versini, who is a lecturer in French at Durham University in the UK. Her first monograph, Le Corps Frontière, Figure de l'excès chez Marie Darrieussecq, Virginie Despentes, and Marina de Vannes, in which she examines figures of excess in women's writing and filmmaking as a way to question bodily frontiers, will be published by Brill in the Faux Titres series in 2023. Her research has appeared in journals such as Women in French Studies, Dalhousie French Studies, L'Esprit Créateur, or Revue Critique de Fiction Française Contemporaine. And Dominique's title today is Reclaiming Agency in Vanessa Springora's Le Consentement. Working title. Dominique.
Thank you very much, Joe. So I'll share my screen with you now. Okay, so you should all see that. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Beth and Françoise, for organizing this symposium, which I'm really enjoying, and I'm glad to be presenting here today. So I'll make a start. In her self-narrative Le Consentement, or Consent, published by Grasset in 2020, and recently by Harper Via for the English edition, translated by Natasha Lehrer, Vanessa Springora describes her sexual and romantic relationship with 50-year-old Gabrielle Matzneff when she was 14. The relationship took place during the 80s, at a time where the artistic world in France was still very much influenced by the rhetoric of sexual freedom inspired by May 68 and the following years. Indeed, Springora notes that their relationship and the many others Matzneff had with teenage girls and boys were well known in Parisian literary circles and regularly featured in his books. Springora describes first meeting Matzneff in '86 when she was 13 at a literary dinner she attended with her mother, whom she describes as a feminist of the May 68 generation. The text is divided in 6 chapters, as well as a prologue and a postscriptum, in which Springora evokes her childhood, notably referring to her angry and absent father, and the bohemian lifestyle that she shared with her mother before meeting Matzneff. She gives a lucid account of Matzneff's calculated strategy when approaching her and refers to him as a predator, using terms such as the prey or the stranglehold in the titles of her chapters. In that way, we can read that Matzneff initiates the relationship by sending Springora a number of love letters, and that he later stages a chance encounter in her neighborhood. She eventually agrees to meet him and they have sex for the first time soon after she turns 14. Her mother initially objects to the relationship, calling Matzneff a pedophile, but ends up tolerating it. And that's one of the most striking ways in which we can think of ambivalence in the texts. The reason why the mother warms up to the relationship is because Springora, as a teenager, experiences it as consensual and reciprocal. Indeed, the call for papers for today's conference really resonates with Springora's writing. Ambivalence is a key notion to read the text on many levels. The narrator uses the term to describe her state of mind years later when still dealing with the trauma, for instance, and here is the quote. And when later on, the different therapists I saw did all they could to explain to me that I had been the victim of a sexual predator, even then it seemed to me that this wasn't the middle way either, that this wasn't quite right. I wasn't yet done with ambivalence. This paper will look at the role of ambivalence in the narrative and the various forms that it takes. I will notably try to answer one of the questions posed in the call for papers, or at least have it in mind in my paper. Does ambivalence create or foreclose power and agency in the narrative? Keeping the time limit in mind, I will specifically discuss 3 key points. The ambivalence of the relationship between Springora and Matzneff, and of the notion of consent by extension. The ambivalence of the role of writing, perceived as an integral part of Matzneff's predation. And finally, the ambivalence of Springora's position regarding sexual abuse and the potential feminist message of the text. So, the narrator describes the relationship, as I said, as consensual and yet as fully traumatic. In France, up until this year, the charge of statutory rape did not exist, which meant that although it was not legal for an adult to have sex with a minor under 15, it was possible to claim that a teenager or even a child had consented to a sexual relationship with an adult. For instance, at the time of the, or soon before, I think, the time of the publication of Springora's memoir, the absurdity of that system came under the spotlight once more when the charge of rape was disqualified against a 20-year-old man who had a sexual relationship with an 11-year-old girl after the judge considered that she was consenting to the relationship. In her book, Les pièges du consentement, So the traps or the flaws of consent that she wrote, inspired by Springora's memoir, Catherine Lemaguerès asks whether women can consent in a context of systemic domination. She notes that under French law, so at the time of publication, the act of not saying no is understood as consenting, and that there is a presumption of consent even for an underage victim. In that context, power dynamics are not necessarily determining factors to understand sexual abuse. In the case of the relationship between Springora and Matzneff, the element of consent is clearly emphasized by Springora. Hence, she describes the beginning of their relationship in terms of mutual love. G declared his love for me in every possible way, she writes, begged me to come back and see him as soon as I could, vowed he couldn't live without me, that life wasn't worth living a moment longer if he wasn't in my arms. And a few pages later, I was in love. I felt adored as never before. And that was enough to efface all my sullenness and to suspend any judgment about our relationship. In addition, the relationship perceived as consensual makes the narrator feel in control of her life. As I noted in my introduction, Springora's father became absent from her life after her parents experienced a difficult divorce. A relationship with Matzneff brings the validation she desperately seeks from older men. In the text, Springora explains how she felt fulfilled in many ways by this forbidden love. At the same time, the text shows very well the manipulation at play and how, in addition to the sexual violence, Matzneff works to deprive Springora of agency in all aspects of her life. He seeks to exert full control over her person by cutting her from her friends and family members and by interfering with her school life. Springora writes about her love for books and writing from a very young age. She notes that she used to excel in her classes of French literature. Yet in a striking scene, Matzneff insists on writing a literary homework she had to complete, and Springora obtains the best grade in the class as a result. She writes, and so the dispossession began. After this, G showed no more interest in my schoolwork, never encouraged me to write or pushed me to think about what I might like to do with my life. He was the writer. In this example, Matzneff literally deprives Springora of her individual voice. And that scene is particularly relevant to understand one of the most important features of the text, which is the ambivalence of writing and the role that it plays in robbing Springora of her own self. Indeed, one of the most violent aspects of the relationship and its aftermath is the way in which Matzneff steals her identity through his writing. He calls her B in his journals and his books, and that's who she becomes, a figure of his invention and fantasy. But if she is dispossessed of herself through his writing, it's also through her own writing that she will find power again. Indeed, the book is about deconstructing Matzneff's strategy using his own weapon, literature, and even, as Elsa Court notes, the same literary form that her abuser had mastered, the memoir. Hence, in Springora's text, Matzneff is reduced to the simple letter G as part of her project to reclaim her agency over him. Indeed, the declared aim of the text is to trap him. Why not ensnare the hunter in his own trap, ambush him within the pages of the book? This statement can be understood figuratively in the text, but also to some extent literally, as I will mention some of the consequences of the publication of the book for Matzneff in my conclusion. Similarly to writing, reading is also forbidden to her by Matzneff. She's not allowed to read his books which would confirm that he is a serial pedophile or a phebophile. However, she transgresses his interdiction, and she notably reads his words describing him having sex with little boys while on a sex tourism trip in the Philippines. Hence, reading brings her knowledge through the confirmation of her fears and the revelation of the denial she has been experiencing. And knowledge brings power. This is a key moment in the shift of power between them, and she will eventually manage to leave him once the seal he constructed around their relationship starts to crack. The question of reclaiming agency as a victim of abuse and as a woman leads me to my final point. Can the journey from V to Vanessa be understood in feminist terms? The text is certainly indebted to me too, as I could observe in her analysis through Springora's story. 2 eras in French history are placed in dialogue, the post-68 years and the Me Too era. Springora herself commented on her desire to bring a small stone to the edifice currently being constructed around issues of domination and consent, always linked to the notion of power. If we think as feminism as a project aiming at empowering women, the text could certainly be understood through a feminist lens. However, the feminism of the text is certainly not militant, and as Douglas Murray noted at an event on post-feminism in France, Springora does not call for a reform of the law explicitly. He notably referred to a passage which can seem surprising in a narrative about sexual abuse and trauma, where she claims, and here it is, love has no age limit, and that if Matzneff had loved her only and did not experience a compulsion towards teenagers' bodies, there would be no crime. So Springora suggests here that a loving relationship can exist between a girl and a much older man, as if dynamics of power could be suspended in the case of an exclusive relationship. So the feminist scope of the text is perhaps limited by her ambivalent relationship with the patriarchal system that made what she experienced possible. And although she describes male violence repeatedly, as well as male support of that violence, whether it is Matzneff's friends or even the police, one of the reasons she gives for her mother's complacency with the relationship is that she did not have a reliable man in her life, and that perhaps things could have been different if there had been a man in the house. So we can certainly find here again the ambivalence that characterizes the book in many ways and which is never fully resolved. But to conclude, as I tried to show in this short presentation, ambivalence is a key notion to read Springora's text and to understand the dynamics of power she describes in the book. In her keynote address on Thursday, Shirley Jordan talked about ambivalence in relation to another self-narrative, Camille Reynaud's Et par endroits ça fait des nœuds, which is about the narrator's physical and mental collapse after experiencing an aneurysm. She noted that Reynaud's book is very much about reclaiming agency through writing, but also that vulnerability is very much part of the narrator's new sense of self. I think this analysis applies to Springora's book as well. It is very much a book about the power of writing, the power to destroy, and the power to rebuild the self. But it is a fragile power, and I think this is really made clear at the end of the text when Springora collapses after Matzneff finds a way to harass her at her work decades after she left him. Despite this ambivalence, I want to say a word about the afterlife of the text. After it was published, there was a widespread outcry and condemnation of Matzneff in the French and the international media alike. He lost a grant, which he was still perceiving from the Centre National du Livre, which is a government body, and he has been shunned from literary circles. Some people who helped and protected him were also forced to resign, such as Christophe Girard, who was in charge of culture in the Paris mairie. It also contributed to the broader discussion on consent in France, as I noted at the beginning of my talk. As Elsa Court observes, 3 weeks after the publication of Le Consentement, a group of 30 representatives in the Assemblée nationale introduced a proposal for the age of consent to be set at 15, citing Springora's book. How is it possible to acknowledge having been abused, reads the passage quoted in the proposal, when it's impossible to deny having consented, having felt desire for the very adult who was so eager to take advantage of you? This led to the change in the law I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, so actual positive change took place. Well, if we consider incarceration is positive, but that's another debate we probably won't have time to engage in today. Finally, another victim of Matzneff's, British journalist Francesca G, announced she will be self-publishing her own account of the abuse she experienced at the hands of Matzneff. G submitted her manuscript to Grasset, Springora's publisher, in 2004, and she was told then that people were not ready to hear her story. So in that sense, Springora's text is about a power shift for the self as well as for the collective. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for that really rich talk and a fascinating kind of exploration of ambivalence in the context of Springora's text. So we'll move straight on, so we've got plenty of time for discussion afterwards, to Adina. Adina Stroia is an early career researcher in the field of women's life writing and visual culture. She holds a PhD from King's College London and is a former visiting fellow at the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR. Adina's research focuses on psychoanalysis, thanatography, aging, queer studies, ethics of care, and visual studies. Her most recent publications include Camille Laurent, L'écriture depuis ça in Dalhousie French Studies, and The Traumatic Structure of the Récit de Mort, Camille Laurent Philippe, in French and Francophone Studies. Her ongoing project investigates representations of aging female bodies in contemporary French literature and visual culture through the prism of an ethics of care. Adina's title today is Féminin, Lesbian Elusiveness, in contemporary French women's writing. Adina.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Good. So thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. This is my first paper as lecturer in French at Newcastle University. And this is an embryonic project, so I will appreciate any suggestions that you may have, as well as your patience. So France's liaison with the figure of the lesbian has been a troubled one, be it in literature, philosophy, or as enshrined in the law. In Léonore Toujours, Christine Angot details her sapphic affair, as well as the self-disgust the entanglement ignited in her. So strong, in fact, was her internalized homophobia that in one of the more provocative and confrontational passages in the text, for such as Angot's well-known marque de fabrique, her trademark, she makes the following remark in reference to her daughter. Mais si j'en fais une homosexuelle, quel échec, quel dommage. Si on me donne le choix entre violée et lesbienne, je prends le viol. Je suis une mère normale qui veut une fille normale. Skip a couple of decades, to 2020 and the publication of Virginie Lesbian by Alice Coffin, lesbian journalist and activist, wherein she takes on the patriarchy by proposing that we should eliminate men. Or so would the media furor caused by non-contextualized excerpt of the text would have us believe. Il ne suffit pas de nous entraider, il faut à notre tour les éliminer. Sorry, I was going to read the translation. So Coffin's seemingly murderous call to arms was not of Valérie Solana's type of taking matters into one's hands, though it would be interesting to discuss at a very different time the cult-like appreciation surrounding the recent publication of this manifesto in French. But Coffin is simply calling for an elimination of men from our culture of consumption, as she herself had done. So the misinterpretation of this passage brought on death and rape threats, as well as an unorthodox and abrupt dismissal from the Institut Catholique in Paris, where she was teaching journalism. But if we were to listen to Coffin and turn ourselves not only towards a feminine and feminist culture mode of production and of consumption, and furthermore towards lesbians, these universal geniuses, as Coffin indicates, where would we then find them on the French cultural scene? And thus begins our adventure. When one goes looking for the female-authored lesbian novel in French literature, it quickly becomes apparent that not only will the journey be long and solitary, but that the destination itself is to become more and more elusive. As Anne Garreta articulated in an article dating back from 1996, which remains absolutely valid to this day, were you, however, to turn your back on the Côté de Sodome, to start inquiring du Côté de Gomorrhe, you would draw blanks. The realization of the concept located at the intersection of such predicates as French, woman, gay, and writer is most problematic. As Garreta further interrogates, and this brings me to the title of my paper, is it in the nature of lesbian inscriptions to be elusive? I will wish to pause here a little to talk about the academic reception of lesbian writing in French and see how this has been evolving. So equally illustrative of the dearth of these lesbian texts is the academic interest they have generated. So to date, Jennifer Welty Walters' Damned Women Lesbians in French Novels from 2000 and Lucille Cain's Lesbian Desire in Post-1968 French Literature from 2002 remain the most representative academic studies on the subject. Welty Walters' study comes to the clear conclusion that after 200 years of lesbians in French novels, the path that they have traced has remained almost invisible. Cairns' comprehensive study on lesbian representation within the French context recovers the figure of the lesbian from the clutches of the male imagination, but its female representation remains nonetheless overwhelmingly underground, even though Cairns mines deep. The mostly little-known texts presented by Cairns offer us an overview of lesbian-themed texts that is more often of sociological interest than of literary value, therefore indicating that representative visibility of the lesbian in literature remains an issue. And this is what Garreta also notes in several interviews, as well as articles, that the quality of whatever is on the literary market, so to speak, is not great. So there is an interest, a thematic interest, but in terms of literary value, they're not very good. So following on from Cairns' study, I operate within the discursive parameters set without for the very clearly and comprehensively articulated definitional lines bear no further bending. The sine qua non of lesbianism is either erotic attraction between women. On the whole, then, my study deploys the word lesbian to mean a woman, female human being, who may not necessarily have had genital contact with, but whose erotic preference is for other women, female human beings, at least in the diegetic or actual present, for I do not conceptualize sexual preference as necessarily immutable and certainly not as a congenital property. I'm thus closer to the constructionist rather than the essentialist position in the debate that has long raged in discourse on particularly homosexuality. Concomitantly, by lesbian-themed text, I designate a text inscribing sexual and perhaps also, but not necessarily, affective attraction between women, female human beings. So I'm trying to situate where lesbian text could be found within French literature and where such opportunities have been missed. And I'd like to turn to the extrême contemporain, to the contemporary extreme, and its extreme heterosexuality. So if I were to turn towards female author texts and literary tendencies of the last few decades, we would come nose to nose with the extrême contemporain. The extrême contemporain has given women writers the chance to expose and explore transgressions done by and women in the form of their own sexual excesses, trauma, abortion, incest, rape, and suicide. However, it must be noted that the very same authors remain corseted by the heteronormative matrix in the realm of both sexual and romantic relationships. So what follows on from this ubiquitousness of the heterosexual romance is a dearth of lesbian literature within the contemporary French canon. So the extrême contemporain remains under the emprise, the clutches of heteronormativity, of compulsory heterosexuality, despite its heterogeneous romantic and sexual configuration. And this brings me to Adrienne Rich and the assumption that most women are innately heterosexual stands as a theoretical and political stumbling block for many women. It remains a tenable assumption, partly because lesbian existence has been written out of history or cataloged under disease, partly because it has been treated as exceptional rather than intrinsic, partly because to acknowledge that for women heterosexuality may not be a preference at all, but something that has had to be imposed, managed, organized, propagandized, and maintained by force is an immense step to take if you consider yourself freely and innately heterosexual. Yet the failure to examine heterosexuality as an institution is like failing to admit that the economic system called capitalism or the caste system of racism is maintained by a variety of forces, including both physical violence and false consciousness. So I started thinking about this topic rather pretentiously by asking myself what the positionality of the sapphic subject is in French literature. For one, must surely be able to find a more than appropriate abode in the much lauded land of the erotic. And this brings me to Virginie Despentes. This section is not very long because I had to cut a lot for time, but just to give you a sense of her position. So even Virginie Despentes, an author who has engaged with a range of sexually transgressive subjects and self-identifies as a lesbian, has made few inroads into presenting a fully developed lesbian narrative. And I'm not necessarily presuming that being a lesbian is transgressive, but within the matrix of compulsory heterosexuality, we may consider it so. So the last quote that is in French, the last tagline is from when she was a member of the Académie Goncourt, because I think she's resigned, but it says that she is equally a figure of the lesbian community and she promotes a new feminism without then saying she's a lesbian. So she somehow, let's say, came out in a press interview in which she said that she wasn't a very gifted heterosexual. À 35 ans, je suis devenue lesbienne. L'impression de changer de planète a été fulgurante. On a retiré 40 kilos d'un coup. In one of her most quoted passages, the first essay from King Kong Theory, she says that j'écris de chez les moches et pour les moches, les vieilles, les camionneuses, les frigides, les mal baisées, les imbaisables, les hystériques et les tarés, toutes les exclus du marché à la bonne meuf. King Kong Theory is going to get a new translation soon, which is quite surprising considering the first translation dates from 2010. The word that they use here is dykes, but in fact, I think to maintain some consistency over the translation, but the exact translation of communers would be, if we're translating cliches, would be butches. And it must be said that the word lesbian doesn't appear in the text in any affirmative sense. So I find, however, that this enumeration, this serialized allegiance can actually dilute any political and sexual meaning. If she writes de chez les moches et pour les moches, les vieilles, les camionneuses, les frigides, les mal baisées, les imbaisables, where is she actually writing from? And so this brings me to lesbian. No, I think, sorry. I haven't had time to translate this, but it brings me to how she engages with lesbian figures within her text. And she has contented herself with presenting her readers with lesbian awakenings in her novels. For instance, in Apocalypse Bébé from 2010 and the trilogy Ernaux Subutext, which she wrote between 2015 and 2017. And her most representative character is the recurring character La Hyène, the hyena, whose strong sexual instincts are clearly signaled for the predatory overtones of her name, as well as this kind of vampiric quality. So under the guidance of the hyena, several heterosexually identified women discover the pleasures of sapphic sex. And for those of you who are in French studies, I want to underline through these passages one of the aspects that I will be looking at in my research, and that is this blurring of bodily limits as described within sapphic relations, and what does this do for like the ontological representation of the figure of the lesbian. I'm going to go back a little, to Anne Garreta, who is a prolific, so this is Anne Garreta, who is a prolific Olympian writer, academic, and self-identified lesbian, but who is nonetheless far from being considered a lesbian writer. Though to say self-identified is a little perhaps presumptuous of me, because she tries not to label herself too much. So this non-allegiance to the lesbian cause is perhaps largely due to her affiliation with the Oulipo, whereby the experimental textual constraints gain primacy over the very subjects of her writing. So Garreta's 1986 novel Sphinx used Olympian constraints to do away with gender altogether, a challenging and impressive achievement given the importance of gender in the construction of the French language. And Jeanette Winterson, I think, in Written on the Body, also did away with gender, but within the context of the English language, that's a little easier. And in this ungendered narrative, Garreta takes herself to task and delivers a story of sexual and romantic entanglements, wherein the reader is unable to determine the gender of the protagonist. And in yet another Oulipian exercise, Pas un jour from 2002, Garreta equally employs literary constraints to highly visible effect. So Pas un jour is translated as not one day. So using as a guiding force no other principle than writing for memory. And she says not a day without a woman. So she says that she's going to sit down and write in a very French manner, respecting the rule of the 35 hours of work a day. So for 5 hours, she will sit down at her desk and write about a woman, whichever way it comes to her into her mind, and alphabetize all these memories without using any fiction. Of course, she tells us at the end of the novel that this didn't quite work and that there is one story that is invented. So Pas un jour is a taxonomical exercise of the erotic. So she provides us with a very detailed catalog of her sexual encounters, as I said, alphabetically ordered. And so while writing from, or indeed in, a lesbian continuum, to borrow a term from Adrian Rich, Garreta operates within parameters of an erotic's disposal. And yet, as Cairns observes in her analysis of the text, tellingly, neither the word lesbian nor any of its cognates is used in Pas un jour. The text bears a dedication à nul, to no one. And this anti-dedication is actually very important to the text and to the text identitarian politics as well as the authors. Because if, following on from Teresa de Lauretis' infamous dictum, it takes two women, not one, to become a lesbian, where then does refusal leave the lesbian existence? This anti-dedication, as Cairns notes, also phonetically resonates as annul, to cancel. Is the lesbian existence then always to be erased? Okay. So I want to look at a quote from the text, l'Amérique au le milieu de nulle part. Voilà peut-être la source de cette exaltation qui s'empare de toi dès que tu y poses le pied. Au milieu de nulle part, qui es-tu? Ici, tu es toi, là, une autre, nulle part, personne. Quoi d'exaltant à cette disparition des marques, à cette fantomatisation nomade ordinaire? Is Garreta then dedicating the text to herself, thus in fact annulling any lesbian status that could be attributed to the author? Garreta absorbs the self and denies herself a lesbian existence, and the word fantomatisation appears there in a very interesting way, because ghostliness is nonetheless the province of the lesbian, as Terry Castle so convincingly articulates in her excellent work, The Apparitional Lesbian, that I haven't had time to talk about today. But even given the ontological murkiness of the figure of the ghosts, even they need to put in a convincing appearance to scare us. So Garreta says that I don't subscribe to any queer or gay and lesbian religion, or to a women's studies or gender studies religion. I believe that all these things have to be considered from a historical perspective and to be related to material social conditions, to institutional normative constructions which mold what identities are within society, and above all, to what purposes they are put. Queer as a critique, that's fine. When it turns into a religion and a new form of social intercourse, I lose interest, Garreta noted in an interview with Dominique in 2000. And this brings me to my conclusion. There are many ways in which we make demands of the lesbian that can be seen as coterminous with a heterosexist and patriarchal logic. They should be visible, assertive, have romantic and sexual entanglement. It is only, however, in the display of the diversity of lesbian embodiments, experiences that one can carve out a sapphic space that exists beyond the realm of the shadows. To my eyes, the lesbian exists in the French cultural space as sourature. And what is more, she exists beyond cliché, for to be a cliché, one has to establish oneself first. And I wish to conclude this paper today by leaving you with a question. Is the lesbian scared of writing herself into being for fear of being written off? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adina. Again, a wonderfully rich paper. And thank you, Dominique. So what we're going to do, I think, is open straight up for questions. If people, like I said before, you can raise your Zoom hands, or I'll try and see you on the screen, but I can't see everyone on camera. So probably best to do that, or to post in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. And again, if you'd rather not come on screen, obviously the session is being recorded, so if you'd rather not come on screen, then you can just post a question in the chat, and I'm very happy to put questions for the speakers. Perhaps I could get started while we wait for questions, while people kind of reflect on those very, as I say, very rich talks. I guess I wanted to a question for both of you, just to start off, perhaps. I mean, both of your texts, both of the texts that both of your papers talk about. I mean, Adina, you mentioned the question of these texts being of sociological value, and I wanted to bring that up perhaps in both cases and ask, what does the literary bring, or perhaps take away from the impact of the social impact of these texts? And Dominique, obviously you mentioned the change in the law, so there's a clear kind of impact, if you like, there. But and in particular, the ambivalent literary. What does that bring, or perhaps take away from the social impact of these texts? I don't know who wants to go first.
Adina, would you like to start?
No, I have to reflect, so if you could start.
I don't know if I have an answer, Joe, but thank you very much for your question. I think what's interesting as well, I think in the case of Springora's text, what could really make a difference is because it's an autobiographical account. So in that sense, the literary is connected very much to a sociological context, but it also was inserted in a particular context. And in that sense, as I said, her text is really indebted to Me Too, and I think in a different context, just a few years ago, this wouldn't probably have had the impacts that it had. So I think what's particularly interesting here in the context of autofiction or memoir, I don't really know what the genre would be exactly, but what's really interesting in how tightly connected it is to the social context, in that case, and how they feed each other. So and it's a very ambivalent social context, because even for her, she mentions after the publication of the book that she felt uncomfortable by the way it was received and how it was used to call for censorship. So even in its societal or social impact, there's ambivalence here. So I think it's very much a dialogue between the text and the context in which it's received. But I don't know if it answers your question, but these are my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, certainly to think about, question of genre and form as well, and the role that plays in how the text is then received socially. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dominique. Adina, I don't know if you had anything to...
Yeah, so most of the works that we have seen have social impact in France have mostly involved men and have been either in a heterosexual context or somewhat homosexual. Other than Springora's text, there's another text, I forget the name and the author, wherein a female author talks about incest in the family, but that takes place between, do you know the name?
La Familia Grande by Camille Kouchner.
Très bien. Between the father and the son, am I correct?
The stepdad and her brother, you're right.
Okay. And so these works have always been about terrible men and the problems that they cause. I was saying that works written by lesbian authors or lesbian themed written by female authors are few and far between. This is why Karen's study was very, whilst it covers a lot of ground, it covers a lot of literary works that aren't of significant literary value. If you look through her work, you'll see that sometimes, I mean, they're 1 page long, and an analysis is 1 page long or half a page. There wasn't that much for her to study in depth. So the problem is that lesbian themed novels are relegated to being kind of pulpy, if you want, like being B-series literature or specialty literature, but not in the good sense. So that was my idea. So there aren't very many women who are female, gay, and established writers on the French literary scene.
Great, thanks, Adina. That's really interesting to reflect on. Dominique, did you want to come in? Got your hand up.
Thank you, Joe. I have a question for Adina. Well, 2 sort of questions. One is like a suggestion, I suppose. Have you considered the work of Wendy Delorme? She is a self-identified queer writer, and she mostly her work is mostly autofictional, and also she just published an amazing dystopia. So if you haven't explored her work, I think it would really be interesting considering what you're researching. And my second question is, you mentioned the elusive lesbian, the ghosting of the lesbian, and you mentioned obviously Terry Castle's work, which, as you know, I really love. And obviously she writes about the American context, if I remember well, but you showed really well that it applies to the French context. But I was thinking, is there something specific in the French context, and notably with the obsession about universalism, that would prevent writers to position themselves as gay writers? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Garretta has a very interesting interview with Jeanette, I think it's Jeanette Savignon, where they talk about the limits between private and public life in France. And so that was very interesting to look at, particularly because in France you have the right to a private life is enshrined in the law. So the atteinte à la vie privée is a charge that gets brought to authors quite often. So it's not it's slander, but it is a lot stronger in sense. So it's really like touching upon your private life. So I think that the difference between these 2 spheres, the private and the public, may have something to do with it. Even when there are coming out stories, Kofan talks about some of them in her book, they're quite muted. I mean, and not a lot of the authors or even filmmakers position themselves as filmmakers first and don't really assert the gay label as much. I mean, everyone knows that Adelaide and Céline Sciamma were in a relationship, but when Adelaide won the César, she said, you know, she dedicated it to Céline Sciamma, whom she loves very much, with a very broken voice. I'm not trying to be prescriptive in the ways people come out or people affirm their identity, but there is a need for diversity. I mean, if no one affirms any identity, where then does that leave the figure of the lesbian? What's very important is why I'm not kind of underlining this is that the idea of queerness and the word queer is getting co-opted into the French space. But that kind of erases lesbian existence as well. And it's also very interesting to look at the word queer that doesn't have the same history in France as it does in an Anglophone context, because the word queer has been recuperated from it being an insult to it being an affirmative stance. So that's what I also want to look at in my research. Sorry for this very long answer.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Adina. It's really fascinating to think about those different linguistic contexts as well. So I see, Françoise, you have your hand up, but there's also a question in the chat, which I just wanted, if you don't mind, Françoise, we could ask is Susan there? Would you like to ask a question, or I can always read it out? Perhaps I can read it. It refers to psychoanalytic approaches to the Springora text, Dominique. So this is a question for you, I think. Susan's just thanking you both for thought-provoking papers. She's wondering whether for Springora there might be a psychoanalytical dimension to think about when there was mention of not being done yet with ambivalence from the interview. Might this also relate to the earlier trauma of the angry, abandoning father and the ways in which this had already formed a dynamic tension, forbidden love, loss, etc.?
Thank you so much, Susan, and of course, no problem with the video. Thank you, Joe, for reading. I think that's an excellent point. I think you are absolutely right, and this is something she even mentioned in the text. So I think she's very conscious of those dynamics and very self-analytical. And she mentioned how therapy, so I don't know if it's psychoanalytical therapy or other forms of therapy, have really helped her come to terms with a lot of what was going on. I think the most striking aspect would, of course, be her unconscious, but the writing self is unconscious of that, but her unconscious desire at the time to get validation from a father figure, which is very very clear in the dynamics, and which he is conscious of and exploits with his various victims. So I think that's definitely a very rich angle to explore. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much for your suggestion.
Thanks very much, Dominique. Françoise.
Hi, so thank you both Adina and Dominique for two really wonderful papers. I have a question for Adina that follows on directly from what was just discussed earlier. So I'm keen to hear more about your corpus, depending on how many texts you are looking at currently. And in relation to that question, I was also wondering how you situate, whether you do discuss authors such as Chloé Delhomme, who have had lesbian relationships that they've acknowledged publicly, but then also gone on to say things like, in fact, my sexuality is a choice and I'm choosing to be heterosexual.
Yeah, this brings me, there's a very famous quote from Julia Barnes who says, I'm not a lesbian, I've only loved one woman. I didn't know about Chloé Delhomme. So my corpus, actually, this work is born out of my research on Marie Nimier, whom I dedicated part of my PhD, and the eruption of lesbian desire within her texts. Interestingly enough, I think that she has some of the most wonderful depictions of lesbian desire and of ambivalence within the French context. So I'll be looking at that as well, and the question of doubles, because she uses a lot of doubles there, and Christine Angot, Despentes, Garreta, and my corpus is still growing. So any suggestions are very welcome. So thank you for the Delhomme suggestion. Is there a part of the question I didn't answer to?
No, I suppose I was just wondering if, in terms of your framing of the elusive lesbian, how you would integrate that discussion of acknowledgement, but also kind of a refusal of the label that happens with certain authors such as Durham.
I think the elusiveness of the label is central, but I'm trying to look at the many ways in which the figure of the lesbian is not ontologically fixed within the texts. Of course, talking about personal identity can get a little tricky. So I'm also interested in questions of, so I'll be looking at doubles, at ghostliness, at this fluidity of the borders of the self, and a discussion on self-disgust in Ernaux, because that's a text that hasn't gotten much attention within the framework of queer studies, which also tells you about the importance of queer studies within the French context. So that's what I have so far.
If I could, you should check the work of RERQ. It's a collective. It's really cool.
Très bien, RERQ.
Oui.
Okay. Très bien, merci.
Well, thank you so much, Dominique and Adina, and to the audience for their brilliant questions. It's been a real pleasure to chair this session, and we've run over about a minute, so I'm conscious that we should have the break, which is a 10-minute break, isn't it, Beth and Françoise? And then the next session will start at 10:15. I understand. Is that right? Sorry, UK time, 10:15. Yeah. So thank you very much, and really, really good to hear about your work. So thank you.
So hello again, everyone. I hope you could grab a cup of coffee or tea, and this is our final panel, which I'm very happy to chair. So we'll introduce the speakers before their papers, and as you know, we will save questions for the end. Also, Felicity Chaplin will unfortunately not be with us today, so we'll listen to 3 presentations instead of the 4 initially planned. So we will start by listening to Ashley Harris. Dr. Ashley Harris currently teaches French at the University of Surrey, and before that she was a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. There she has taught language across the levels, as well as teaching on French art, literature and film, spanning the 19th century to the contemporary period. Her research interests include popular and visual cultures, contemporary fiction, socio-criticism, and the role and reception of public figures, including the concept of the media author. Her PhD thesis has been the source of several distinct articles, as well as an upcoming monograph with Peter Lang in the European Connections series, edited by Professor Marion Schmidt and Dr. Hugues Azerad. It is titled L'écrivain médiatique, Gender, Fame and Media Authorship in Contemporary French Literature. Her paper today is entitled Big BD, Despentes, Welbeck and Transmedial Ambivalence. Over to you, Ashley. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. So I'm actually going to slightly disappoint you and not talk about Despentes today, partly from a time constraint, but also because I saw Jemima's paper and I thought, well, maybe actually I'll let you focus entirely on her, and I'll focus more on 2 slightly different cases. So let me just get my screen back up and I can make a start. Okay, you see that okay? Yeah. Super. So as I said, originally I was thinking of bringing Despentes into this, partly because I'm really focusing on her at the moment, but with a kind of 15 kind of minute slot. It's quite hard to talk about 3 people, I've realised, so I'm going to condense it a little bit, and I've chosen to really remove Despentes from my thinking for now, and hopefully Jemima will be happy to take the relay on that. So what I'm looking at today are different types of transmedial ambivalence, so looking at a sense of ambivalence towards media from the part of authors. Today I'm talking primarily about Michel Houellebecq and Frédéric Beigbeder, who you can see on the screen, and already you can see some kind of hints at their interests going beyond literature. As you can see Houellebecq there with Iggy Pop beside him, and also Frédéric Beigbeder in his show Le Cercle, which is primarily a film review show. So, Michel Houellebecq and Frédéric Beigbeder are part of a generation of mediatized authors who began their literary careers at the beginning of the 1990s, a significant period in the development of the digital age, marked particularly by the creation and the ascent of the World Wide Web. Others of that generation include Virginie Despentes, Yann Moix, and Christine Angot. As their creative trajectories have progressed, prominent changes have impacted the literary field, including the rise of social and participatory media and technological innovations that have created new forms and modes of digitalized media and multimedia activity. As well as the effects of the digital age, hegemonic mass culture has impacted the production and reception of literature. Hannah Arendt argued that mass society, unlike the society beforehand, wants not culture but entertainment, and the wares offered by the entertainment industry are indeed consumed by society just like any other consumer goods. Bourdieu drew a distinction between a subfield of small-scale or restricted production oriented towards the reward of symbolic capital and a subfield of large-scale or mass production, oriented instead towards economic capital or success on the market. Diana Holmes has reflected on this in the literary field, describing the impact of mass market-based systems on literature as increasing the importance of economic capital over symbolic capital. Philippe Villain has described this in negative terms, stating that la littérature, today's literature, prétend être une réponse positive aux quêtes esthétiques, spirituelles, existentielles, inhérentes à la condition humaine, sans reconnaître qu'elle est surtout une réponse pragmatique aux préoccupations mercantiles, comme aux intérêts sociétaux de son époque, qu'elle est un simple divertissement culturel. The tension that rises in this context in the narratives of Beigbeder and Houellebecq is one where they voice concerns for the purported diminishing status of literature and author in a mass and digital age context, while also engaging fully and in highly visible ways in mass media culture, much more than most other authors do. So I'm going to speak first about Frédéric Beigbeder, who you can see in this ad. This is actually an underwear ad that he directed and also starred in. You can see him in the top left corner. So contemporary author and man of many other fields, Frédéric Beigbeder has asserted for the last 20 years in his narratives that mass media and digital age, the mass media and digital age context represents a threat to literature. He argues that the text is aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, en danger de mort. In and out of his works, Beigbeder argues that the text has depreciated in value to the point of the possibility of extinction. However, as will be discussed, to respond to this supposed threat, he invests in the very media forms and strategies that he holds at the centre of his criticism. Beigbeder writes novels primarily rooted in contemporary society, depicting modern-day life and typically focusing on portraying society's flaws, in particular reflecting on the pervasive influence of mass media and digital technologies in texts such as 99 francs, Au secours, pardon, and the emoji titled L'homme qui pleure de rire. In each of Beigbeder's novels, his evocation and critique of contemporary society is achieved in part through a broad intermedial web, which Durham describes as une profusion de références audiovisuelles, que ce soit par l'intermédiaire du cinéma, de la télévision ou de la photographie. Through heteroglossic networks, employing references to magazines, television shows, films, porn and pop stars, his texts reflect a broad mass media cultural horizon that exists beyond literature. Through this heteroglossia, Beigbeder evokes and calls into question what Marc Angenot calls a discours social, est la représentation discursive du monde tel qu'elle s'exprime dans un état de société, une production qui présuppose le système complet des intérêts dont une société est chargée. Big Betty's writings show how social discourse, as it manifests and is propagated across media forms, dominates his protagonist's visions of the world and dictates the events of his novels. His novel 99 francs is a productive case study to show in greater detail how his criticism of mass media and digital landscapes operates in his oeuvre. In 99 francs, advertising director, a post which was previously held by Big Betty, Octave Bourango realizes that the industry in which he works is deeply corrupt, so he endeavors unsuccessfully to destroy it from within. The novel is explicit in setting up a criticism of consumerist mass market logic. The characters of the novel lead hedonistic, media-obsessed lives reliant on selling and possessing the latest product. 99 francs describes the goal of all humans today as gagner suffisamment d'argent pour pouvoir ressembler à une publicité. The characters use mass brands to define themselves. For example, Octave introduces himself as Je me prénomme Octave et je m'habille chez APC. This alienating obsession with mass goods and appearances proves deadly in the novel. Several characters die of suicide or overdose, and despite Octave's superficially altruistic goals to overthrow the advertising industry, the novel ends with the protagonist participating in a brutal sexual assault and murder of an elderly woman with his colleague Charlie. This graphic murder scene underscores how Charlie's many years spent fixated on blockbusters, advertisements, and violent pornography have led him to lose the ability to relate to other humans or to differentiate between the real and the fictional in a Debordian spectacular turn. His detachment from reality is confirmed when Charlie calls himself James Bond, as he sexually abuses and kills the elderly American. Certain Beauvoir affirms the triumph of the spectacle in this scene. Ils ont déjà dépassé la ligne entre surface et profondeur, entre virtualité et réalité. Le triomphe du système qui engendre l'esthétique de la surface et l'anéantissement de l'individu qui se perd dans l'univers de l'irréel. The novel shows that mass culture products are viewed as merely distractions by the characters when they actually end up propagating pervasive discourses that change how they behave and how they understand their world and their place in it. This in this novel occurs to the point of the characters murdering an elderly American stranger while imagining themselves as characters in a film. Big Betty has discussed the impact of the context he describes in his novels on literature in his non-fiction narratives. In Dernier Inventaire avant liquidation, a title which alludes to the concerns detailed within on the declining status of the novel, Big Betty asserts that the literary text is now more than ever en danger de mort. Big Betty describes the text as having depreciated in cultural value and relevance. Despite the attacks levelled at mass media and consumerist markets in his text, Big Betty acknowledges that he has changed his own approach to literature because of them. He explains that he has adapted the content and style of his writing to compete better with mass media and its impact upon the place of the novel, insisting that authors have long needed to concurrencer le cinéma. Il fallait arriver à donner une force au roman qu'il n'avait plus. Indeed, within his text, Big Betty often finds ways to engage with other media. Even links to YouTube videos accompany Une heure et sa lingère, making it what he describes to be the first YouTube novel. He has also directed his own adaptations of several of his novels into mainstream films. Big Betty argues that this is an obligation for his literature to compete with mass media forms, but the result is the paradoxical investment in the very forms and consumerist logic he describes as causing its depreciation. When I asked about this engagement, Big Betty described his work as being a sort of pop littérature. Je suis une sorte de symbole de cette littérature qui a voulu rivaliser avec toute cette culture pop. Pourquoi il y a le pop art, mais pas la pop littérature? On a Andy Warhol et Jeff Koons, ce n'est pas nul, c'est de l'art. This statement demonstrates that Big Betty seeks cultural relevancy through the use of popular and attempts to frame and validate this choice through asserting its similarity to a celebrated and legitimized art movement. This pop littérature perspective is one that allows Big Betty to address the current cultural landscape and how value is attributed within it, while also announcing a self-proclaimed quest to save literature through employing the popular culture that it competes with. He argues that this is essential due to the text's marginalization. stating, la lecture, il faut arrêter de la séparer. On est un peu puritain avec le livre. C'est peut-être ça qui risque de condamner le livre. Significantly, this putative quest to save literature does not fully rationalize all of Big Betty's engagements with popular mass media. Big Betty is a highly visible figure recognized for many engagements in the media, including hosting radio and television shows, directing and starring in films, DJing, creating CDs, and producing and starring in advertising campaigns. His arguments for pop literature and the necessity of being less puritanical with literature do not fully explain all of these engagements with popular mass media, particularly when one considers his role as the editor of Lui magazine and his cameos in underwear advertisements and pornography. Big Betty's alleged authorial strategy to the text paradox sees him seeking commercial gain and cultural relevance through involvement with mass popular culture. Rather than a quest to salvage literature, what is emphasized instead is an attempt to sustain his own image and career. When I asked about this positioning, Big Betty responded, En fait, ça a toujours existé. Molière était un acteur. Jean Cocteau a fait des films, des peintures, des poèmes. J'adore Colette, elle était stripteaseuse. Ça ne l'a pas empêché d'être un écrivain sérieux, beau et grand, qui a beaucoup fait pour la libération de la femme. Here Big Betty postures in relation to other artists, linking himself to canonical literary names to situate these many mass media engagements. His comparison to Colette is perhaps the most revealing, relating his media activity to that of a female stripteaseuse. This association underscores Big Betty's reliance on the highly visible fetishization and commodification of the writer across media forms. Pierre Jourde argues that it is precisely this type of authorial strategy that threatens literature, stating « Ce qui pose problème, c'est la marchandisation, c'est-à-dire soumission de l'écrivain aux médias qui lui demandent de se prostituer ». Reflecting on his career, Big Betty asserted that this market-focused and multimedia strategy has however been an unavoidable obligation. Aurais-je pu vivre autrement? Je ne le pense pas. Like Big Betty, France's renowned provocateur Michel Houellebecq has reflected in his narratives and interviews on the place of literature in contemporary society. One of the enduring traits of scholarship on Houellebecq is the interest in the author himself, in particular with regards to reception and intention. So I'm thinking of people like Jérôme Messos, Raphaël Baroni, etc. In his works, Houellebecq refers to various forms of contemporary media, including song, television, film, and art. However, he has openly criticized the pressure of mass culture on the arts, framing it in Debordian terms in his non-fiction text Intervention. He states les distinctions antérieures entre film, clip, actualité, publicité, témoignage humain, reportage tendirent à s'effacer au profit d'une notion de spectacle généralisé. Houellebecq suggests that mass culture has caused a loss of differentiation between media forms due to this spectacle, where other media, such as film and advertisements, are assigned as much attention and worth as the novel, and the latter comes to imitate the former. This is reflected in his novel La Carte et le Territoire, in which image representations come to dominate reality, as the novel's title suggests. The novel follows several characters whose jobs entail the challenge of trying to create representations of reality, including Jed the artist and the auto-fictional character Michel Houellebecq, the author. The relevance of Baudrillard in this novel is alluded to in its title, as Simulacre et Simulation opens with the assertion that le territoire ne possède plus la carte, ni ne lui survit. C'est désormais la carte qui précède le territoire. Bivik has argued the shared preoccupations of Baudrillard and Houellebecq in the face of une société de consommation où les signes l'emportent sur les choses. La Carte et le Territoire depicts how representations across media forms come to construct the characters' lives and how they view the world. Before Jed becomes successful, he spends his days seeking distraction from reality through a heavy routine of television watching. Sa principale distraction quotidienne devint le visionnage de Questions pour un champion. In this instance, as in many others in this novel, the description of media both reflects a contemporary cultural context, but also highlights the character's dependence on and domination by mass culture forms that in the end act mostly as distractions, and in Jed's case, distraction from making new art. To further illustrate this dependence, the novel evokes the funeral of one of Jed's friends and the guest's inability to disconnect from their mobiles to connect to the reality of the situation. Jed avait été choqué que certains des assistants n'aient pas éteint leur portable au moment de la crémation. This dependence reflects another of Baudrillard's works, The System of Objects, in which he asserts that consumer society imposes a bland uniformula, a profound monotony that constitutes a devolution in the bliss of the consuming masses. Indeed, there are even sections of Wikipedia articles that Welbeck interposes covertly verbatim into La Carte et le Territoire, which for many readers went unnoticed until they were pointed out by journalists. As web pages fill the novel, the flatness of Welbeck's writing style and of the cultural landscape is highlighted. Welbeck argues that these references to mass media in his novels are part of an attempt to depict the culture in which he lives, arguing c'est l'inconscient qui parle, je me mets dans la peau du spectateur ordinaire. These references reveal the significance of mass media in defining the characters and their place within society. For example, Welbeck's protagonist prefers spending time home alone watching television or going out to socialize, a fact which emphasizes their alienation. The cultural preferences of the characters are shown to define them. For example, in La Possibilité d'une île, Daniel et Esther argue about Larry Clark films, a dispute that comes to underscore the age gap between them and the implausibility of their relationship. In the context of digital innovation and mass media, autofictional character Welbeck represents nostalgia for the old ways. He is depicted as still writing with pen and paper, avoiding his computer and all other forms of technology. The narrative's focus upon older objects, such as Jed's traditional boiler, stands in opposition to the technology-obsessed mass culture that's depicted. The boiler features at the very beginning of the novel when it needs repairing, and survives until the very end, outliving Jed's father and Welbeck, and is described as his plus ancien compagnon. There's thus an element of fetishization of the old in this novel, a type of salvage exoticism that mourns the loss of former ways of living against the new cultural values of a new millennium. Welbeck has outlined his awareness of the impact of the cultural state of affairs that he's described and its associated pressures on literature in his non-fictions, stating sans doute les éditeurs pas plus que les producteurs n'en sont-ils de véritables hommes d'affaires. Ils cherchent aussi une certaine forme de reconnaissance culturelle que, curieusement, ils associent aux médias. He highlights the integration of media mergers and market logic into publishing strategies. Like for Big Betty, this has led to changes in his own authorial strategy as he spreads his influence and authority across other media forms. On Tout le monde en parle, Welbeck described his primary literary goal as to sortir la poésie de son ghetto, showing a desire for cultural relevancy for the author and the poet and his writing. This shift in cultural values that Welbeck details in his narratives is very much embodied in the type of success he establishes as an écrivain médiatique. Indeed, his career is bolstered by media and mediatization opportunities achieved through many polemics and an active exploitation of his caricature in films like Near-Death Experience, Saint-Amour, Talasso, and L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq. As Versini has argued, Welbeck's overarching oeuvre has a marked character of transmediality, as it has involved the creation of music, films, photography, and multimedia exhibitions, as well as adaptations and collaborations with artists and singers like Iggy Pop. Thus, to summarise and to conclude, Welbeck and Big Betty both present a critique of mass culture in their narratives that they argue diminishes the status of literature and the author. However, there's an ambivalent or conflicting tension in these assertions when presented alongside their many mass media engagements. We've outlined the resultant paradoxical rhetoric that asserts the need to protect or salvage the novel from mass media culture through engagement with it, and hinted at the fact this is perhaps more the author figure that they are both trying to sortir du ghetto. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much. Thank you for your excellent presentation. So as I said, we will do questions at the end. So I will move on to the next speaker, but thank you very much for your presentation. So Jemima Jobling is a third-year PhD student in French studies at Newcastle University. She studied French and Russian at Downing College, University of Cambridge, where she also completed an MPhil in European, Latin American, and comparative literatures and cultures. Her research interests lie in contemporary women's writing and visual art, with particular focus on questions of class, sexuality, and the body. Her PhD thesis explores expressions of social class in the works of Annie Ernaux, Christine Angot, and Virginie Despentes. In 2020, she co-organized a seminar series titled Class, Confinement and Criminality, and you can find the recordings on the IMLR website. So her paper today is entitled Un exercice d'éclatement, the multimedia universe of Virginie Despentes. Thank you very much, Jemima.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Thank you, Dominique, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Ashley, for your paper. That was so interesting. And I was sort of really busy scribbling down loads of things. I think there's going to be some really interesting conversation that comes out of both of our papers. I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about that in a bit. But yes, so I'll begin. So in 1990 in Lyon, 4 years before the publication of her first hit novel, Baise-moi, Virginie Despentes, and here she is in these images in the blue vest, recorded an album of feminist punk rap, Fear of a Female Planet, with her band Stroia. Though perhaps, as Colin Nettlebeck suggests at first glance, Despentes' musical activity is not particularly remarkable, a more thorough exploration reveals, as I will outline in this paper, how striking, distinct, recognisable and important this earliest artistic output is. Though critics, scholars and journalists have tended to overlook this admittedly obscure LP, they have written extensively on Despentes' musicality more broadly, as well as on her punk rock image, affinity and style. Michelle Charles delineates Despentes' allegiance to punk and its political signification in her 2012 article looking at Bye Bye Blondie. I've neglected to translate these slides, so I'm just going to sort of gloss them briefly in English. So Michelle Charles writes that Despentes sort of pursues a punk kind of protest that is strongly anchored in the left and in sort of precarious milieu. As Tom Armbrecht confirms, if Despentes speaks fluently the language of music, she chooses punk rock specifically to articulate the importance of social revolt. Nettlebeck makes a particularly compelling case for considering the novelist as DJ in relation to Vernon Subutex. Indeed, music is unsurprisingly central to this trio of novels centred around the descent into poverty of a former record shop owner. Further still, however, Nettlebeck argues, music is an underlying principle of the novel's composition and structure. Despentes' collage technique, her incorporation of multiple narrative voices and perspectives, which can be seen in Apocalypse Bébé as well as in Vernon Subutex. As Nettlebeck notes, this is very much a musical strategy, composing a text from different voices, rhythms, and resonances. Indeed, Despentes plays these voices as if they were records. Many critics and interviewers have spoken about her works as having soundtracks. Some have pointed out that her writing demonstrates a rap-like flow and rhythm. So she has the declamatory style of a rapper, and she has flow. Lauren Elkin has said of King Kong Theory that there's something aggressively incantatory about it, a kind of battle rap braggadocio. And braggadocio is a technique used by MCs, a sort of bragging or boasting technique. So throughout her career, Despentes has repeatedly described her style as constitutively sort of inflected by punk and rock. So she pursues rap and punk applied to the book. Her own stance on writing and its musicality and interaction with musical influences is seen when she compares the craft to musical production sort of directly. So here she says, I made a first novel in a similar way to how the Ramones made a first album. In interview, Nettlebeck notes, she compares her writing process to musical production, a live recording followed by extensive studio reworking. So the strong link between her early musical endeavours and her subsequent turn to novels is made particularly explicit in an interview for Le Point in 2018, wherein Despentes speaks directly about her experiences with Stroia. She reveals that Baise-moi was written straight after the band parted ways. When asked about whether her experiences as a lyricist and rapper informed her writing, she had this to say. So did this sort of serve as a mold for writing Baise-moi, sort of finding a music with words? And she says, yes, completely. The fact that I wrote rap and songs, because that's how I started to write. French rock and French punk is a particular kind of schooling in a very efficient type of French. Besma was really born from that directly. She says, I belong to the family of authors who have rhythm, who seek a rhythm. So I want to move on to talk about the content of these songs and briefly look at some of their lyrics, but I first want to play you a really short sample of one of the tracks, very short because I'm aware of time, so let me find this, and I hope it works. If you could just give me a nod if you can hear this.
We are at war! Sur les voies de l'égalité, beaucoup de chemins parcourus. Ce que nos mères ont su imposer, leur vérité face à la bienséance, malgré l'intolérance. Mais si avant toi, toutes les filles avaient tenu pour acquis ce que Camille, on leur avait appris, vous travaillerez encore pour 3 fois moins qu'un homme. Alors, avant de déclarer, je n'ai aucun problème avec les maths, féminité, réfléchis à 2 fois, ton identité reste profondément marquée pour tes positifs associés avant même que tu ne saches parler. Lucie, bien vraiment sur le chirurgie, c'est leur prestation sur stage. Manip de cartographie, problème des mots par les parents sans crainte de se tromper l'ennemi. Un alcane, cercle dans les esprits, la mort courte page, numéro 5 portrait.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for indulging me with that. So yes, just in case you hadn't heard that before, just to give you a flavour of the sound and the mood, that was the beginning of the first track on the LP called We're at War. So throughout the album, the voice of a 20-year-old Despentes is an angry roar. Joined on vocals by hometown friend Versini, the two front women spit out their lyrics rapidly in an at times almost conversational canon. Fear of a Female Planet is a rush of heavy bass and bolshy guitar riffs. Riotous and rhythmic, its roaring chords and the accompanying angry rap chanting seat the album firmly in the riot girl movement that emerged in the 1990s and that combined punk music with a third-wave feminist thrust. The heavy thudding of drum machines keeps tempo as the distortive push and pull of record scratches carries a listener along on a catchy yet gloriously cacophonous whirlwind that feels like a musical manifestation of and precursor to the kind of gritty feminist anger that characterizes Despentes' writings. And anger, as we can see, that needs to find multiple forms of expression, so spilling over from music to text to film and beyond. A distinctly Despentes artistic and political stance emerges from the polyvocal rush and is amplified against the track's high-tempo discordance. So the writer has spoken several times in interview about the value and importance in looking at songs as texts, and having also confirmed herself as the band's lyricist, it is thus perhaps unsurprising that the songs on this album share numerous thematic similarities with the novels she would go on to write. Feminist principles and issues of gender equality are Stroia's main themes, and the words they invariably rap, chant and sing speak to this political engagement. So here on the left we have a line that says, your identity remains profoundly marked by the tons of ideas inscribed, instilled in you before you even knew how to speak. So this suggests an early awareness of the socially constructed quality of femininity. And we might here be reminded of Despentes' language in King Kong Thierry, where she talks about women as sort of being construite, so constructed, or formatée, so conditioned or brainwashed. Similarly, these lines on the right of the screen might evoke her description of marriage in King Kong Thierry as a market. In King Kong Thierry, she talks about marriage as a market where women sort of resign themselves to doing housework for free. So we can see that her cynical views on marriage have not changed much between the writing of these lyrics and King Kong Thierry. Her lyrics pay homage to a feminist lineage. And the young singers belt out, and this is the opening to the track that I played you on the left here. So on the path to equality, a lot of ground covered, our mothers knew to assert or proclaim their truth in the face of propriety, despite intolerance, etc., etc. So circling refrains of "I don't want to be a victim anymore" and "Not a girl's place, there's no girl's place" make each track feel like a protest song. Throughout the album, the violence and pain of sex-based injustice can be felt in every syllable spat out. Further still, Despentes' own story of sexual abuse that features so heavily in many of her texts could also be heard in another cathartically noisy track. And we can see here on the left some sort of artistic graphic interpretations of that song as well on these lyric sheets. Sorry for the quality of these. These are maybe rather creepily from Karazina's Facebook page. This particular rap relay features a parroting of the kind of victim-blaming abuse that is so often cruelly thrown at survivors. So I'll just nip back here. So on the right here, how were you dressed? Are you sure you cried out enough? You don't seem too traumatized. Where are the marks of violence? The setting of Despentes' novelistic and musical texts are also very similar. The urban landscape of Lyon forms the backdrop to the whole album, but this is particularly apparent in a song titled Despentes, the album's second track, and also the area of the city from which the writer famously draws her nom de plume. So we can see just how foundationally important this period is. So opening with booming guitars and punctuated with punchy, anthemic exclamations of hometown, the rap battles through descriptions of the city's urban environment. So she mentions taggers who are marking the walls with their name next to sort of sketchy slogans and posters. And then on the right, all the stars of the neighborhood, so punks, ganja people, skaters, riffraff, feature in this musical tribute to the discreet ballet, the sort of toing and froing of the city. If in texts such as Baise-moi, and I quote from Shirley Jordan, Despentes brings vividly to the page decaying fin de siècle city fringes and evokes the texture of France's urban and suburban underworlds and margins, her songs arguably constitute auditory equivalents. So how and why might we apply these interesting finds or parallels or precursors? So why is this important? So I suggest that analysis of these early rap texts deepens further this sense that Despentes' works are suffused with a formal ambivalence, a sense of quote unquote conflicting forms. Shirley Jordan and Michelle Charles have explored in 2004 and 2012 respectively Despentes' formal ambivalence. She invariably incorporates and plays with the genres of trash, crime, polar, noir, fairy tale, pornography, etc. In her 2018 introduction to a special issue on Despentes, Charles notes that, there's just some posters there as well. I might go back to those in a minute. Charles notes that due to Despentes' use of slang and her intertextuality with popular culture or genres, she has been condemned for being anti-literary, anti-intellectual, and trashy. Denise Saint-Amand has written a fascinating article examining and comparing the authorial postures of Virginie Despentes and Patti Smith, both of whom have produced musical and literary works. He outlines the receptions of their respective work. While some critics have treated Despentes' incorporation of rock into literature as trivial or a mere hobby, Smith's fusion of literature into rock is lauded as elevation or an intellectualization of rock. He writes that the reception that Patti Smith's literary posture receives is diametrically opposed to the contempt or disdain that the rock universe of Despentes can provoke, something that he says seems to perpetuate an arbitrary hierarchy between artistic fields. Despentes then has historically been seen as sullying literature. There's a fascinating class dimension here, which your presentation actually also had me sort of thinking in this way as well. And as Dominique said in my introduction, expressions of class in Despentes forms part of my thesis more broadly. But what this does suggest for the purposes of this particular presentation is the ways in which ambivalent use of forms can be transgressive. So I suggest that Despentes' musical output is in fact remarkable. A closer look at the song's lyrics and moods lays enriching groundwork for our understanding of the fundamentality of the formal ambivalence she continues to incorporate in her texts. Despentes' music, regardless of its quality or auditory appeal, she has herself commented on her limited talent for singing, is a valuable, constitutive and fun and interesting part of the multimedia universe that is her oeuvre. Shrouded in subculture and housed in a punk anti-establishment lineage, Straight Royer's Fear of a Female Planet is replete with early articulations of the kind of thematic interests that form the foundational thrust of Despentes' Wrightsley project. The fiery flow of rousing lyrics speaks of a taste for vengeance and of a political alignment with society's most marginalised. The record demonstrates an already established, already articulated Wrightsley position, feminist impetus and devotion to exposing and creating art from society's most neglected, abused and distasteful margins. Despentes' voice belts distinctively across the decades and out over the booming bass and grungy chords in an imagined and in some ways very real soundtrack to her later literary works. This brief exploration of the earliest underexplored indicator of the writer's artistic project broadens, deepens and fleshes out the kind of mediatized, transmedia self-portrait we have of the writing and Wrightsley construct that is Virginie Despentes. Thank you. And that's some of my references.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jemima. That was a fascinating presentation, and it's so interesting to discover an unstudied aspect of Despentes' work. I didn't even know that album. So thank you for playing it, and I look forward to listening to it after the symposium is over. If you have a question, you can either, as you know, pop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand or your actual hand if you prefer. Ashley, I see you already have a question, so please go ahead.
Is that okay? I'm super keen. Thank you so much for those papers. They were so interesting. And obviously, Jemima, I feel like I have a lot to chat about with you in a really good way. And I just find what you said really interesting. And it was such a good synthesis of what's been said already, as well as kind of adding to that. So thank you for doing that. I'm wondering, just partly linked and off the back of Eric's paper as well, do you see social media as playing a role in what Virginie Despentes does? Because I only know of her Instagram account as far as I'm aware, but do you see that playing a role in it? And if so, what role does it play?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. Thank you for that question. I was sort of thinking about that as Eric was speaking as well. I think I've just kind of not thought about that too much, really, because I was sort of focused on this very early kind of, creative period. And I think her work is incredibly inflected by social media as time goes on. Although I think I read recently somewhere that she'd read something about social media, or, she'd sort of basically become really cynical and kind of cut herself off from it. There is a lot, I think, about Eric's presentation made me think about the way Despentes uses social media, or has in her sort of fictional texts, because Vernon Subutex was her Facebook pseudonym, and I can't remember the name of the character in Vernon Subutex that sort of has these multiple Facebook accounts and sort of logs into different ones. I think it's I do see it playing a really important role, but I think it's one that I've not really sort of fleshed out fully yet. But I think it's fascinating to think about, because she stems from this world, but is also very much of this kind of social media generation. But there is this kind of nostalgia she sort of expresses constantly for this, this time, a sort of a more maybe sort of hopeful time in the world, or sort of more politically, engaged kind of time. Just sort of turn into a bit of a ramble there, but absolutely. I have a question for Ashley, if I can just jump in and like change.
Please go ahead.
Change topic. Yeah, I guess I just wondered if I wasn't sure what the angle you were going to take with Despentes in your presentation was going to be, but I was really sort of interested in all of these instances of sort of the
sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just noticed Ashley's put it in the chat that her internet has dropped out.
I've turned off my camera to hope that it helps, but it does keep saying it's unstable. I more or less heard what you said, Jemima. Quite awkward timing. So thank you for that response. I'm just going to keep my camera off because I think that might help, but I am listening. So thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just that the sort of the notion of at one point, one of the quotes was "Il faut arrêter de la séparer," the sort of sense of being a bit sort of puritanical with literature, and it makes me think of one of the articles that I was reading for this paper. Sort of said, "Oh, Despentes kind of presents herself more as a rocker than as a writer," and I just kind of instinctively thought, "Oh, why do we really need to sort of have those really clean categories?" And I think, yeah, for me, I mean, I just kind of look at everything through this kind of class lens, but I can't help but feel that it's a kind of, in sort of the talk of the status of literature, it's this kind of like high-low kind of discomfort with kind of sullying literature. I just wondered if in the Begbede, I don't really know, and shamefully Welbeck, I also don't really know. I just wondered if the if class kind of comes into your thinking around these ideas of kind of the shifting idea of literature.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I guess, no, I haven't thought about class that much at this point, partly because and I completely agree with the things you're saying, by the way. There's definitely a trend of people writing saying that any writers that engage with other media are therefore not really writers, that it's a vulgarisation de la littérature, that as soon as it's, in any way commercialized, it's that like prostitution de la littérature or de l'écrivain. I mean, there are plenty of people writing on that. I know Diana Holmes has written a lot about kind of the different brows of literature, for example. I mean, her work's really interesting. And that does start to tie in class into some of it as well. So I would recommend Diana Holmes, but it's not something that I massively have focused on, but maybe I should. I guess partly that was because, well, in a sense I did, in the sense of when I was looking at Welbeck and Begbede in particular, these are white, heterosexual, middle to upper class men. I mean, particularly Begbede came from a very affluent background, Welbeck as well. Neither of these two writers had an underprivileged background by any means. And it has contributed to their success and their ability to gain more success and more opportunities and to gain good deals that kind of are beneficial to them, that let them work across media forms. Whereas when you look at someone like Despentes, she is often trying to do similar things, but having to seek recourse to crowdfunding. So like already there are differences in kind of their approach to media, and also their success in accessing funding, and also just in terms of the reception of what they do, it's really quite different. So I think about the kind of films that Begbede has made that have gone on to be kind of mainstream films, get the big funding and to be relatively successful and have, big premieres and things. Welbeck's work, maybe not so much his films, but he's less involved in those, but more things like his art exhibition, the Palais de Tokyo, they are able to be big hitters in terms of what they do. Virginie Despentes, you obviously know that she did the film of Baise-moi. That was so hugely criticised, and it was all really quite tightly tied into gender in the end, around the fact that she used former prostitutes in the film. She was kind of put into two boxes, and like this ties into what you're saying about labels, which is very true. Someone, I can't remember who wrote about it, but someone was writing about her being pushed into either being, oh, she's a victim de bas de fond, it's so hard for her, she was impoverished and then, had to become a sex worker. Or on the opposite end of it, she is kind of like the bad girl of literature. It's just all very gendered, of like either she's, impoverished victim, or she's the bad girl. And I mean, that would tie into her class in a way that I hadn't really thought about before, but it's a really good point. Thank you for raising it.
Oh, thank you. It's so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? Perhaps while you think about it, I'll ask a question to our three, or perhaps Françoise, you wanted to ask a question. I don't want to hog the conversation. Go ahead.
You can go first if you like.
Well, you go first and then I'll ask after you.
Okay, I was just going to follow on from that conversation. Thank you for all those papers, which were, so interesting. And I've just been thinking about what I'm working on as well. And it was interesting that you brought up gender there, Ashley. And I was thinking about gender and dépend. And I was just wondering, Jemima, I heard that in Vernon Subutex that Vernon started as a man and started as a woman, as the protagonist. And then Despentes changed the gender of Vernon. It felt more coherent somehow, and she felt that all her female protagonists had received a lot of criticism in the past, and that with the protagonist as a man, the trilogy was better received. He wasn't criticized. He could do whatever he wanted. It was seen as serious and political. And I wondered just if you had anything more to say on that in terms of the writer, but also the protagonist relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, actually I agree. That's so interesting. And yeah, it's really true. You know, Despentes talks about that a lot, talks about how she was sort of shocked, but also not shocked by the sort of more positive reaction that the Vernon Subutex trilogy had. And it's kind of what has really sort of catapulted her into this sort of like canonical, kind of like classic, literary classic sort of sphere. I think, I think it's hard. I think one of the problems I'm having, I've had with writing my thesis is kind of, particularly in the case of Despentes, is kind of extricating this mesh of class and gender, because you can't sort of really talk about one without the other. I think there's an interview at one point where Despentes says that she sees social class is sort of intimately linked to femininity, or vice versa. And I think the intersection, I think, is just really integral to her whole writing project. I was thinking about, actually, when you were saying the sort of it's prostituting literature. Well, Despentes in King Kong Theory sort of explicitly says, writing for me is like prostitution. She said there are all these similarities. The fact, I think she says, the fact of selling what is intimate is exactly the same. This kind of I don't know, but I also think it's interesting the sort of the gender dynamics. I suppose she has this sort of way of performing class as well. It's inflected by sort of, as I sort of argue in my thesis, as a kind of autobiographical kind of sociological kind of feeling, even though her works are fictional. But it is a kind of performance or exaggerated performance of class dynamics. And she has this kind of, like the character who has these multiple Facebook profiles, she has this kind of chameleon way of kind of putting herself in different sort of skins, I suppose, and sort of that polyvocality. Again, sorry, I feel like that was a bit of a ramble, but yeah, thank you for your question. It's really really important, and again, it's quite hard to sort of ignore the gendered aspect of Despentes' work. Thank you, Françoise, for your question.
Thank you.
I'll begin by introducing our final speaker for the symposium. Thank you very much, Frankie, for agreeing to share your work with us today. And just a big overall thank you to everybody for coming throughout the symposium, and especially today on a Saturday. I'm sure there are lots of other things to be doing as well, but thank you so much for taking the time to spend the morning with us. So Dr. Frances Egan is a lecturer in global studies at Monash University, and she works at the intersection of gender, cultural, and translation studies. And she is currently examining the social rules that regulate emotion in the writing of French authors such as Faiza Gen and Fatima Das. And today, Frankie's paper is titled Serious by Association, Reading, Theorizing, and Teaching Men's Writing as Women in Literary Studies.
Sorry, I lost my mute button. Classic Zoom failure. Thank you so much, Françoise and Beth as well for organising this. And thank you for everyone who stayed until this lucky last paper. That's really appreciated. So yeah, as Françoise said, unfortunately, this was a kind of joint paper, a dialogue, but I'm going to present today. But I just wanted to acknowledge Ruth, who is my colleague, and a lot of the what I'm going to present today has come from quite a few conversations the two of us have had recently, but also over some years since we started our PhD. And we wanted to spend a bit of time today asking some of the questions that are left out of the scholarly work itself. So as academics, why do we choose the texts, literary, film, cultural representations that we do as objects of study and also as objects of pedagogy? And how does kind of identity play into that? So I'm going to start with a text itself. This isn't something that I've been working on. It's just something that both of us read and enjoyed for pleasure recently. So Anna Burns' phenomenal novel from 2018, Milkman. There's two ideas that come out of this novel that will structure the talk, one about reading, one about teaching. So Burns' story is set in a town that looks like Belfast and in a time and that sounds like the Troubles. But one of Burns' remarkable stylistic choices is to evoke this very clearly, but without ever explicitly naming time, place, even characters. So the protagonist, who goes by Middle Sister, likes to read while she's walking around the streets, and obviously it's a dangerous time. The streets are not necessarily safe, and her reading is seen as a bit of an affront. She's in her interior world, but she's also on the street in a public space, and it's seen to be somewhat deviant. And Milkman, the eponymous and violent paramilitary who is interested in Middle Sister, sees this as kind of something that she shouldn't be doing. She should be putting her attention elsewhere. And she says, I'm walking, I'm reading. He says, you can read in the car. So her active reading is simultaneously apolitical, removed from politics and from the time in terms of the Troubles, but it's also political for that very reason. It represents the kind of independence that a woman in that deeply sexist society was not meant to be able to achieve. So this is one thing that I'm going to come back to. And the other aspect is in terms of teaching. How can the classroom be a place where we stay open to seeing and hearing things that don't simply confirm what we already believe? So one thing that happens in the text is that Middle Sister goes to French class, and the teacher suggests that the sky is a colour other than blue. All the students say, no, le ciel est bleu. And even when the teacher takes them to the window and asks them to really look at the colours, they're overwhelmed and turn their backs to the sky. And the narrator says, if what she was saying was true, that the sky could be any colour, that meant anything could be any colour, anything could be anything, anything could happen at any time in any place to anybody, and it probably had too, only we just hadn't noticed. So I'm going to be thinking a bit about what we read, and also, I guess, what we notice, what we don't notice, and how that might structure ourselves as scholars, and also our students and knowledge kind of going forward. So I'm going to bring in my own experiences then as a PhD student, and then becoming a lecturer and academic. And starting with my PhD, where I wanted to escape into words, into another world, into language, like Middle Sister in Milkman. And it wasn't something that I really expressed even to myself, but I didn't want to do anything political. I loved books, literature, and I simply wanted to study the poetics, the text, escape in the sense of losing reference to a real world, abstracting, theorizing, and kind of unsituating the language. And interestingly, in Milkman, Middle Sister loses herself in the 19th century canon. So she evades her political present and a 20th century which she dislikes, in a world predominated by white men and by a Western canon. So Dostoevsky, Stern, Flaubert, etc. And similarly, I chose a book by a white male French writer from the interwar period for my translation-based PhD. And my perspective today with growth as a thinker, and also with cultural change, alerts me to the deception in anything that locates politics or ideology elsewhere and claims universalism, claims to be for all. But at the time, I saw a bit of a distinction, or I followed one that was made in certain circles between writing politics or writing about politics and the politics of writing. So internalizing who was allowed to do which. Whose writing might be framed as feminist, ideological, protest literature, radical, and whose might be seen to be objective, rational, so they could write about the external politics, they could write about others. And the default standpoint, which was uninterrogated in interwar France, meant that the author that was the object of my study could presume to write for all, to all, and to imagine abstracted, fantasy, stereotyped others without worrying about knowing them. On the other hand, outside of that, or on the sort of a sense of a periphery, are many people who even today are granted authority to speak only from their own experience and for a niche audience. So you could still claim that women writers, women's fiction, still read predominantly by women, still called a woman's book rather than a book, etc. But taking a step further than that, in terms of who is marginalised, women of colour, I have this quote from Tracy McMillan Cottom, who says that we were writing personal essays because, as far as authoritative voices go, the self was the only subject men and white people would cede to us. So being only able to write about one's own self, but also that writing to be marginalised. So the personal essay then deemed to be dead, or deemed to be not as serious. And on top of that, the writing of the self still regulated by a dominant culture. So I have the example of First Nations voices and Evelyn Arulian saying, editors asking, can you add more language in terms of Indigenous languages, or can you cut that? Always kind of too much, too little, supposed to speak to their own subalternity rather than to write what they choose. So in this sense, the connection between self and text, which representations are allowed, which selves are allowed, which selves are serious, who has authority to speak, all of these questions, it's something that's influenced my own path, at least subconsciously, in terms of how I understood myself as a woman, reading, researching, becoming an academic. And for my master's degree, I'd wanted to translate the debut novel of a white French woman who wrote for women's magazines, was editor-in-chief of Grazia at the time, and wrote about romance, heterosexual gender dynamics. I brought it up with my supervisor, who thought the text was interesting, maybe even clever, and we had a chat about where it avoided being superficial, where it distinguished itself from other Chiclet-esque texts, where I would need to be careful rendering it into English to maintain that cleverness in the translated text, not to make it a sort of Bridget Jones, not to impose my own superficiality as a young woman. So I could easily have carried on with this project, but doubt had crept in. The feminine was negatively connotated, and the necessity for it to be serious seemed to be self-erasure. So Gia Tolentino describes this sort of self-erasure that many women experience and the way that it's in conflict with what women are to themselves. She says to herself, a woman is inherently central and essential. To society, she is inessential, secondary, defined on the terms of her relationship to men. For Rebecca Solnit, there's an element of non-existence in that disconnect, where one shapes oneself to a category, despite that category being inherently fluid. And as Solnit goes on, being so often required to identify with a protagonist who isn't like us, a writer whose lived experience is different, can stretch the sense of self thin. And obviously this stretching is not felt evenly. Women of colour in particular are being stretched to the limit. Roxane Gay writes about identifying with the Sweet Valley High blonde protagonist and says that she was not supposed to identify with them. But in fact, we expect those on the periphery to identify with those in the centre. And Gia Tolentino describes identifying with Jo March, but not expecting the Jo Marches of the world to see themselves in her. And this is that sort of double consciousness, which we've heard a little bit about throughout this conference, where, as Beauvoir writes, you see yourself from the perspective of others and you see them naked inside out, back to front and from behind, but it's not a mutual act. So there was nothing to stop me from translating that novel for my master's, but it felt it would be more work to establish myself within the academy, within the frames of reference, to prove that it was not only feminine and there was something more there. And in that sense, to grow as a scholar, but to diminish myself and perhaps perpetuate a focus on a masculine-feminine binary that ignored others' experiences of being stretched thin. So there's this question then, is it better to be serious by association? And I've got this quote from Siri Jusfeldt, who was writing on Norwegian writer Carl Norsgaard, and saying that a man writing the domestic offers a creative tension, whereas a woman novelist is in double trouble. If she writes imaginary stories, such soft stuff is made all the softer by a female identity, and if she writes about her own experience, she may well be relegated. So my feelings were that a young woman PhD student was not serious, but the subject matter could be. And I've articulated all of this retrospectively, but for a while I didn't even think to question the blue sky. Didn't know yet that it was only blue because it's been called blue, represented as such so many times by the right people. And what else was I missing? So in Milkman, middle sister, aside from the French class realization, or not so much a realization, but a dismissal, she senses that those who see her reading as deviant aren't quite being fair. She experiences discomfort, repugnance, fear at the way Milkman assumes entitlement over her body, over her attention. But all she can ask herself is, where did he come from? So this kind of encapsulates her sense of bewilderment and ambush, but also her desire and right to inquire what is deemed natural. Middle sister was brought up, however, in a society with ground rules, which she knew and had internalized. And she says in this quote that if no physically violent touch was being laid upon you or no outright verbal insults, nothing was happening. So how could you be under attack from something that wasn't there? At 18, I had no proper understanding of the ways that constituted encroachment. And I've got here a quote from Miranda Fricker, who writes on hermeneutical injustice, which is the gap in collective interpretive resources, which puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. So if we have all that work in the canon, in the centre, about certain lived experiences, but not enough about others, then there's that difficulty in articulating those and in being heard. So there's a lot of important work to be done in this kind of figuring out of the framing and in resisting, critiquing, creating alternate realities. In my case, I ultimately made gender the crux of my scholarly work, focused on the women characters, critiqued the masculinity, included myself. And this is, I guess, part of projects, particularly in feminism, to create alternative figurations for women's identity and subjectivities. As Roxane Gay says in her writing, I realised that I'm understoring myself after years of allowing myself to stay damaged. So that work of bringing closer the representations and our own experience. At the same time, however, my thesis centred male identity in order to critique it and perpetuated the Western canon. I also centred myself as a white woman in feminism. And there's some work on this from feminists like Marilyn Fry and Adrienne Rich, who both suggested that feminists should be disloyal to whiteness by refusing the material and ego rewards conferred on them through their association with white men. Instead, they should actively work against their privilege. And at the same time, there's critiques of that approach. So Eileen Morden-Robinson, for example, analyses the inherent ambivalence in white feminist academics' self-presentation as anti-racist. She argues that such scholars often explore difference, but don't challenge the default, the universalist centrality of whiteness in their feminism. So I guess what I'm asking and what Ruth and I have also been asking is how can we do the work in the classroom or even in a conference like this without only serving ourselves? Where there is that epistemic difference in the gap between worldviews, who does the work of scaling that difference time and time again? And how can we start somewhere else, not the pre-established, the canonical? Or could we be open to a different starting point that we don't quite understand yet? Perhaps the sky is down. So we've been thinking then about teaching as a way of looking back at our formation of scholars and the way that our own kind of progress and critical thinking evolved. And I'm wondering, can the students bypass some of those steps, especially now that society's evolved, not begin with the canon, with a certain view of history, with certain landmark texts? And what responsibility do we have now as sorts of authorities to make the labour different, to avoid perpetuating that epistemic violence and to teach into a productive ambivalence? Especially since, and actually I haven't spoken much about class here, but there's the privilege of reading and thinking. And with it, Macmillan Cottam says, comes great responsibility. When you have that privilege, precisely because so many others like you, in her case, she's referring to Black women, are systematically filtered out of every level of social status, then the responsibility is especially great. So where to start then? How to organise knowledge in a way that doesn't perpetuate these binaries? And I've been thinking about this in terms of syllabus. So last year, just taking a slight step away from literary studies, I was working on 2 new units for gender studies at Monash, Monash was creating a new major and we needed 2 first-year units. Starting the syllabus from scratch, I couldn't fathom where the start point would be. If I set up self and other for that experience of woman as otherness and the visibility of gender, I was perpetuating the binary, setting up man and woman in order to unpack and disrupt it. Similarly, that stereotype of woman as other and what that looks like pretends to be abstracted, but really refers to white women characteristics around fragile, objectified, thin, etc. So I know that I need to situate and localize and that we need to do that. But to make simple and then complex was to privilege the pre-established and the problematic. So how do we start in specifics and multiplicity, but still create a narrative for first years, for example, to grab onto? And we started constructing content around epistemologies, gender and language, gender and politics, gender and history, which seemed good but tended to the chronological, perpetuating an established and Western canon from which to springboard, from which to add those experiences as secondary and extra, things like race and culture, even though they're part of the way that gender is constructed. So just thinking about alternative ways, I guess, thinking about feminist pedagogies such as Made Famous by Bell Hooks. And Hooks tells us that the classroom isn't about transferring fixed content to empty vessels, but about producing new knowledges together. So students are part of this building in a de-hierarchized classroom. And I've been thinking about that if we want to be open to hear, to look for knowledge with a cultural lag, that formation that we've had, that older academics have had, that other generations that we have now had as authorities, is a way to bypass that, to start with students' experiences, where the student population may already have more diverse experiences. So look at perspectives that stem from the reading material, but also from students' own experiences, so that they can build rather than self-erase in favour of what is already there. Another aspect is starting with core texts or core themes. Is the problem of the corpus that it is that canon and it privileges a certain perspective? And could we begin instead with the questions, the themes, and bring multitudes of ways of knowing into dialogue with each other? So finally, just to finish, we wanted to explore some of those links between the text and ourselves as situated and embodied in the real world, not only to articulate what's already there, but also to think about how often ambivalent connections in terms of identification, difference, erasure, are in fact constitutive, and what that means about how we read, how we research and teach, what is overdetermined and what can't we yet see. So this idea then of not only making visible the colourful sky that's already there, but about allowing it to come into being. And also thinking about whether we do see the same colours as other people. Is the blue the same, that you see the same as what I see? So how can we look for those commonalities and build knowledge while still sitting in ambivalence and not knowing, accepting that there are colours we might not see? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frankie. That was just wonderful, and thank you, Ruth, as well, for this dialogue that you guys have established. It's very rich, and I feel as though, sorry, there's an aeroplane going over my house. I hope no one can hear that. Yeah, it's real. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, and also for centering yourselves. Or Frankie, you were presenting, so centering yourself in what you were doing, and giving us that personal perspective. That was really rich. Could I open the floor up, get any questions from anyone? I'm sure we're all, I know I'm still sitting with a lot of the things that you shared with us. It's very thought-provoking. So yeah, anyone wants to start off? Can't quite see anything in the chat. I'm still thinking of my questions too. I've got so much going on in my head.
That's fine. It's late you're in Brisbane, Beth?
I'm in Brisbane.
Yeah.
I'm a morning person as well. So maybe I could just start with a kind of, I don't know whether it's like a perfect question, a fully formed idea yet, but I think you really concluded on a note that I was kind of on something that I was thinking about throughout your paper, in the sense that you really tackle this idea of ambivalence in the sense that you concluded with the idea that kind of a classroom can be a dynamic space in itself, and that as an authority we should be open to newness, and that can be a learning experience in itself, or at least that's how I was reading listening to or interpreting what you were saying. I think that there's necessarily a large degree of ambivalence as kind of an intellectual posture in itself that we need to think about teasing out the nuances and the contradictions in everything, and that's a part of experience, and that's a part of how we should treat anything that we look at. Am I kind of understanding that right, or did you want to elaborate on that idea of ambivalence at all?
Can you just rephrase a little bit? Sorry, I'm just trying to work out where there's so many ideas in that.
Totally. Well, I think there's so many ideas in your paper as well. I'm still kind of like going through it myself, so it's definitely not a fully formed question at all. But it is like, is there anything that, can you continue on with that idea? Like, you finished by talking about ambivalence, and I feel like it emerges in the classroom in many different forms. It emerges in the fact that there can't be kind of like a whole singular answer, and that there's contradiction and uncertainty in what you're proposing, precisely because the way that, because it's a place of creating new knowledge, I think. Where's the citation that I wrote down? So Bell Hooks saying that a feminist pedagogy is where new knowledge is created instead of transferring fixed knowledge and having a correct answer to everything. It's more about being dynamic in that way. And that's kind of asking everyone to just sit in this uncertainty. I just wonder if you can say more about that, if that's something that you resonate with, or if I'm totally misinterpreting what you're saying.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think, I have a couple of thoughts on that, and I can also see that Barbara's written, what do the students think? And it's interesting because a lot of these ideas, it's then so difficult to think about what that looks like in practice. I've been thinking a little bit about, uncertainty, like you say, Beth, and how that should be embraced as a positive thing, because there's a lot of work on things like being too certain as being kind of willfully ignorant of other perspectives, like with, I guess, taking your own perspective as truth. And therefore thinking about embracing uncertainty as a way to be open to other experiences and to be open to a learning experience. But I think that I'm still working out, what that might look like in the classroom. And I'm thinking, so Barbara said, what do the students think? And one feedback that I received from a student prompted me to think about this chronology, because a student said that they felt like the perspective of race was secondary, that it was so crucial, and that the unit put in a lot of perspectives, but that they were sometimes kind of last. They were coming kind of on the end. And I was thinking about that in terms of getting that feedback from the student, and really kind of well-constructed feedback, and thinking, I guess, what can we do with that, and how could we, I guess, include students in that, changing the organisation of that. But at the same time, I think that it's tricky as well, because there's also still attitudes around, we want to be told, we want the authority from the lecturer to receive information that we can understand and that we can learn. So I think that there's barriers there as well around,
Absolutely. Barbara, did you want to say something there?
No, I just wondered if the students were, as I generalise massively about students, if the students were sometimes looking for certainty, and if there was bewilderment at you offering them uncertainty, and how you negotiated that.
Definitely, Barbara. I think that, they, in my experience, a lot of them do want certainty, even for, assessment. What exactly do you want me to produce so that I can produce it? And I guess that's part of the process of thinking about how we change the kind of goalposts. This does not have to have one answer, one response. I am open to you producing different things. You will not be marked according to, we have an idea in our head, you must reproduce that. So I guess if there's kind of flexibility around assessment, that maybe that could prompt a little bit more happiness with the uncertain. But it's something that I'm just kind of thinking about too, myself, having done this paper and thinking about where could we go forward. So maybe I'll be able to report back in the future.
Yeah, no, I would love to see where this goes. I feel like it's like a personal and professional project that can continue on, and that's a lot of trial and error in the classroom. Françoise, I think, has got a question.
Thanks, Frankie. Thanks for sharing all the discussion that you've been having with Ruth. It's really fascinating and important. You're raising a lot of important questions. I'm wondering, in terms of the way it can be, I suppose, I don't like to use this term, but marketed towards students in a favourable way, perhaps focusing on more of a methodological approach could change that perceived idea of the need for certainty, the need to perpetuate a certain given idea or interpretation. Not sure what you think of that.
Yeah, thanks, Françoise. So a way that students could then approach things and have a kind of method to go about. I guess the other thing I'm thinking, and it's not directly related to that, but I kind of hinted at it at the end. I don't mean to say that there aren't, I guess we've been looking at ambivalence, and I know, Françoise, your work has been so much on ambivalence, and it's not to say that there are answers that everything is right. It's not a post-truth, you can say whatever you like. There's still an understanding that we do have to work towards lived experiences which are real, and to understand those and to work at those. And there are certainties there in terms of how people experience things, in terms of how people feel. But I'd specifically be thinking about questioning one's own standpoint. So perhaps in terms of method, then there's a way there about, okay, how do I know what I think I know? What might I be missing? Who do I need to ask? What do I need to read next? As just kind of, I guess, prompt questions. It's not that there is no answers, but are my answers the only ones, I guess? Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I think that when you use the word methodology, Françoise, I wonder whether it's like having that, everything that you're saying there, Frankie, is like as just asking students to have a certain attitude to learning and to knowledge and to the production of knowledge, and how they can expand their worldview, and just have a general openness to whatever they're looking at, to whatever the object of study is. I'm not sure whether this is what you're saying, Françoise, but it's almost like rendering explicit to the students from the beginning how they could approach, like whether that would be a way of saying to them, like, try and be more questioning. So actually kind of discussing how you hope their approach to things should be, in a more explicit sense, and saying this is how I've structured it for these reasons. So just being really transparent. And so the challenging decisions that you're making with a course, when you're saying how are we going to do this in a way that kind of aligns with your kind of ethical approach to learning and pedagogy, it could be that you just completely make that totally transparent to your students and be like, well, when we're thinking about this course, this is our concern and this is our solution. Like, any feedback, but also we're asking you to approach it in this way. Maybe that could be a way of, as well as the flexibility to assignments, it could be good things to try in trying to create this kind of more feminist approach to pedagogy. I'm not sure whether that makes sense.
Might I ask a question, please? I don't hear you.
Yeah, go ahead, Maggie, of course.
Thank you very much. Frances, I think your students are very lucky to have someone like yourself to be asking so many questions and reframing the way one looks and reads and experiences literature. I suspect you and I are a different generation. And I remember that most of the people lecturing to me were male. Now, we're now many years away from that. Do you feel that since there are more women in the profession, that actually this can reshape the way one looks at a text, whatever century they might be? One takes a completely different framework to look at it, and therefore gives the students far more freedom.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maggie, and also Beth, for that idea of just making things explicit at the start. I think, Maggie, you're right that definitely things are changing in terms of who is part of the faculty. And I think that's happening in terms of gender, in terms of race as well, but that's still perhaps behind, and class. And I think, of course, it matters because if they are mostly men from a certain type of experience whose perspectives you were reading, or whose perspectives were, lecturing to you, it's just diversifying those perspectives. So the same as, I guess, who's in editing positions, who's in publishing, who's in the mainstream media, in terms of framing the texts, what's allowed to be called serious and worthy of study, and why, for what reason. So I definitely think that that's changing. I guess I just think that there's still work to be done.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions, anything to add? I'll have one more question if that's okay. And it's, so you've said that you guys were talking, is based on your experience, these discussions might have had their origins back in the PhD days. I'm just wondering whether there was ever a moment in your discussion or in the classroom or while you were reading something by any of these great scholars that you were citing, whether there was ever a moment where you're like, hang on a minute, when you actually decided that this is like a kind of a thought that you wanted to turn into a discussion and eventually like decide to present and actively think about it as opposed to just a passing thought? When did it become conversation with a friend and fellow scholar and pass into this ongoing conversation? Was there a moment or a experience or event that happened? Maybe not, maybe you don't know it, but that's just a more personal curiosity, I guess.
It's actually so fascinating of a question, Beth, because I think that it's part of my same questions or our same questions about what's deemed, worthy for a conference paper, what should be in your article, where is personal experience or your own relationship to the text relevant and not, where is like other scholarly texts important, and where is just like essays published in a book for the mainstream part of a scholarly work. And I think that there's some of the questions we've been having, and I think that we should thank you and Françoise for that, because you were very flexible with this, and when you suggested it and we both wanted to present, we thought, oh, they'll be open to anything. So we were like, we'll bring it into scholarly form there.
That's brilliant. Thanks. No, that's really cool. Thank you so much for for bringing such a really important perspective. Thanks to both of you for that. Does anyone else have anything else to say? Because I would have one other question if I could drag it out a little. Is that all right, Françoise, or am I dragging it out a bit long? 1 minute over time. It's kind of a comment that you may or may not disagree with, and it might also be me kind of misunderstanding aspects of what you're saying. But in asking students to try and decenter themselves, if assuming they have kind of a more privileged position, but in asking them to ask questions in order to see things from other perspectives, is that not also a centering of the self at the same time? It's actually giving yourself permission to be more personal and to acknowledge the relationship between an individual and the text at the same time. It's kind of a centering of the self and your own subjectivity, which is involved in an opening. It's like a relationality and opening out to others. Is that kind of like a to and fro, or like that understanding yourself in like an interrelational sense is kind of at once centering others and centering the self at the same time in the way that you approach the text? I hope that makes sense. Maybe it's not a bit.
Yeah, it's just speaking of ambivalence to me, just one at the same time. Yeah, no, definitely. But I guess one of the papers that I referenced, I think her name was Sulufa Zidani. She was talking about a way to bring student perspectives in, and the idea was that you still have a text, a literary text to read, or a cultural representation or whatever, and there's a representation of something in that text, and you can talk about that, unpack it, but then students could also say, okay, my experience of this, I'm just trying to think of an example that's not, because I think that, if there is something that students can bring of their own experience to that, you might get further perspectives there. So if you're reading a book by someone in America, whether they're a white woman, whether they're a woman of color, whether they're a man, and then someone else who is from somewhere else in the world can bring in their perspective, but still relate it to what does this text show us. And so I guess in that sense, there is both. It is kind of about what can your experience bring to it and what can that share for others. So also stepping back and hearing those other perspectives as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's, all really interesting. And thank you. Big round of applause for Frankie and her at present invisible collaborator. Really wonderful. I don't know whether you want me to do the concluding words, Françoise, or we can do it together, or
I think we can both say a few final words. I'm sure we'll both say this, but thank you all so much for joining us today, and I think that was a wonderful note to end on. So I will definitely keep on thinking about this question for a while to come. What do we do with these ambivalent texts, and how can we think about teaching and reading in terms of that ambivalence, and how can it be productive in a broader sense as well. And I think particularly in terms of our position as language scholars, so we've been put into all these different sorts of categories as we frame ourselves as academics, as we frame our research. And one of the goals of this symposium was to work across the languages and bring together lots of different perspectives. So I hope in that respect we've been successful in a kind of ambivalent pedagogical method. So thank you all, and I'll pass over to Beth for the final remark.
I couldn't have said it better. I think that's really wonderful. I might finish on a more administrative and boring note then. Thanks so much to Françoise. Thank you so much for working on this with me. It's been such a pleasure. and to the IMLR for hosting, and to Kathy, who's been amazing with advertising, technology, administration. She's been so lovely and guiding. The chairpersons were so helpful to us. I was really tired at some points through the conference, and so our chairpersons were wonderful. Our panelists, such a rich contribution, and also our keynotes, which we're very grateful to for having supported us in bringing some notoriety to our symposium, I think. And of course, thank you so much to the participants, because you're definitely just as much a crucial part of a successful conference, because you're the ones that stimulate the conversation and that respond and that create discussion around the things that all our panelists are throwing out there. So thank you to everyone for their participation. And yeah, I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks so much for coming, being with us.